Tonight, we step into the suffocating, neon-lit humidity of a tropical paradise that was slowly, inevitably tearing itself apart from the inside out. The year is 1952, and the island of Cuba sits perfectly suspended in the warm, turquoise waters of the Caribbean, operating as a glittering, profitable extension of the American economic empire. To the wealthy tourists, the Hollywood celebrities, and the powerful businessmen flying down from Miami and New York, Havana was a flawless, intoxicating playground designed for their absolute pleasure. It was a city of sprawling, magnificent luxury hotels, pristine white sand beaches, and massive, air-conditioned casinos where the roulette wheels spun quietly under heavy, sparkling crystal chandeliers. But the men who actually controlled the quiet, lucrative mathematics of those casinos were not Cuban politicians. They were the ruthless, calculating architects of the American mafia. Figures like Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano had essentially purchased the capital city, transforming Havana into an untouchable offshore banking center and a secure sanctuary for global organized crime. They poured millions of dollars into the local economy, building corrupt, efficient syndicates that dominated the hotels, the nightclubs, and the sprawling, lucrative underground gambling networks. But if you walked away from the bright, pulsating neon lights of the Havana Strip and drove just a few hours into the dense, heavily forested interior of the island, that glittering illusion instantly evaporated. The vast majority of the Cuban population lived in crushing, relentless poverty of the rural countryside, surviving in a parallel, brutal reality that the wealthy foreign tourists never actually saw. In the sprawling, intensely hot sugar cane fields of the Oriente province, hundreds of thousands of landless peasants lived in fragile, dirt floor huts devoid of electricity, running water, or basic sanitation. The entire Cuban economy was dangerously, structurally reliant on a single volatile export, sugar, which dictated the brutal, unforgiving rhythm of rural life on the island. During the brief, grueling months of the sugar harvest known as the Zafra, the peasants worked themselves to physical exhaustion, swinging heavy iron machetes under the blistering tropical sun. But when the harvest inevitably ended, the foreign-owned sugar corporations simply closed their doors, plunging the rural workforce into a devastating period of mass unemployment, known locally as the dead time. Entire families quietly, desperately starved. Preventable diseases swept through the countryside entirely unchecked and entrenched. Corrupt local politicians ignored the profound, systemic suffering of their own people. A massive, unnatural chasm had opened between the mafia-funded wealth of the capital and the desperate, bone-crushing poverty of the provinces, creating a pressurized, unstable social atmosphere. Yet, despite systemic corruption and massive economic inequality, the Cuban people still clung to a fragile, cherished belief in the power of their own democratic institutions. They possessed the progressive constitution of 1940. They held regular, contested elections, and the young, idealistic university students of Havana genuinely believed they could eventually vote their way to a better republic. They were actively, enthusiastically preparing for the highly anticipated presidential election of 1952, rallying behind reformist candidates who explicitly promised to tear out the deep roots of corruption and permanently expel the American mobsters. But in the early, quiet hours of March 10th, just 3 months before the citizens were scheduled to walk to the ballot boxes, that fragile, cherished illusion of democracy was violently shattered. Fulgencio Batista, an ambitious, charismatic former military strongman who was running a distant, humiliating third place in the presidential polls, decided that he was done with the inconvenient mathematics of democracy. Operating with the cold, calculated efficiency of a seasoned military commander, Batista quietly drove to the massive, heavily fortified Camp Columbia military base on the quiet outskirts of Havana. He had spent years quietly cultivating unwavering loyalty among the senior officers of the Cuban armed forces, promising them lucrative promotions in exchange for their unquestioning obedience. Before the sun even rose over the glittering casinos of the capital, Batista's heavily armed military forces rolled seamlessly into the quiet streets, seizing the national radio stations, the major newspapers, and the presidential palace without firing a single shot. The sitting president, realizing he had lost control of the military, simply packed his bags and quietly fled the country, leaving the terrified republic in the hands of a military dictator. Batista immediately, systematically suspended the revered Constitution of 1940, cancelled the upcoming democratic elections, and installed himself as the unquestionable ruler of the island. The United States government, prioritizing predictable regional stability and the protection of American corporate investments over the abstract concept of Cuban democracy, formally recognized the new, illegal military regime within a matter of days. The American mafia, relieved that the anti-corruption reformist politicians had been eliminated from power, quietly delivered padded briefcases of cash to Batista, ensuring their lucrative playground would remain undisturbed. To the wealthy elite and foreign investors, the bloodless coup appeared to be a brilliant, successful, necessary stabilization of a chaotic, unpredictable political system. But to the educated, passionate generation of Cuban students who had spent their entire lives studying the democratic ideals of the Republic, the coup was an unforgivable act of national betrayal. Batista had looked an entire generation of political Cuban youth directly in the eye and told them that their votes, their voices, and their political futures were meaningless. He failed to understand that when a totalitarian state closes the polite, quiet avenues of democratic reform, it opens the dark, violent pathways of armed revolution. By dismantling the legal constitutional framework of the country, Batista had stripped his regime of moral legitimacy in the eyes of the public. The quiet, simmering frustration of the impoverished countryside fused violently with the high-minded, articulate political rage of the urban youth, creating a toxic ideological powder keg. The citizens realized with cold, terrifying clarity that systemic corruption of the Republic could no longer be fought with polite legal petitions, well-worded newspaper editorials, or peaceful, organized protests. The uncompromising, entrenched machinery of the military dictatorship only listened to the blunt, terrifying, undeniable language of physical force. And out of this profound sense of political disenfranchisement, a new, radical, militant vanguard began to quietly, fiercely organize in the dark shadows of the capital. They were not seasoned military veterans or trained international spies. They were angry, articulate lawyers, accountants, and young university students who had firmly decided that the Republic was worth dying for. Batista had arrogantly assumed that his heavily armed, well-paid, professional military would crush any disorganized, amateur resistance to his newly established, profitable order. But as the heavy tropical heat settled over the quiet, terrified island in the summer of 1952, the dictator was unaware that he had forged the exact conditions necessary for his own destruction. The polite, compromised political center had evaporated. The iron doors of peaceful reform were permanently locked, and the traumatized, radicalized youth of Cuba were quietly beginning to gather their weapons. When a legal system subordinates itself to the blunt, unforgiving force of a military dictatorship, the citizens who genuinely believe in the constitutional order are rapidly forced into a dangerous binary choice. Fidel Castro Ruz was not born into the crushing, desperate poverty of the Cuban sugarcane fields that he would eventually successfully claim to represent on the global stage. Immediately following Fulgencio Batista's illegal, bloodless military coup, Castro did not immediately reach for a rifle or disappear into the dense, forested mountains to launch a disorganized rebellion. He chose to weaponize his legal training, intending to force the compromised, intimidated judicial system of the Republic to publicly legally validate or explicitly deny the reality of the dictatorship. In a calculated formal act of political defiance, Castro calmly drafted a rigorously detailed legal brief, walked directly into the massive, imposing marble halls of the Cuban Supreme Court, and officially sued the new dictator. He systematically demanded that the highest judges in the land sentence Fulgencio Batista to exactly 108 years in a high-security state prison for the documented, undeniable crimes of sedition and military treason. The predictable dismissal of this researched legal petition by the terrified, compromised judges provided Castro with the exact, undeniable constitutional justification he required. By legally proving that the highest court in the nation refused to uphold the Constitution of 1940, Castro could logically, forcefully argue to the Cuban people that peaceful, democratic reform was now a mathematical impossibility. Having thoroughly exhausted the polite, quiet avenues of the law, the frustrated lawyer immediately pivoted his organized intellect toward the dark, complex logistics of a violent, armed insurrection. He began to quietly, methodically build a secretive, compartmentalized underground organization simply known as the Movement, operating beneath the heavy, watchful surveillance of Batista's military police. The core demographic of this clandestine organization was not composed of seasoned military veterans, wealthy political elites, or trained international assassins, but rather ordinary, frustrated working-class civilians. Castro and his trusted second-in-command, a quiet, organized young accountant named Abel Santamar, specifically recruited plumbers, bus drivers, bank clerks, and dissatisfied factory workers from the sprawling, impoverished neighborhoods of Havana. They understood with cold strategic clarity that the established political opposition in Cuba was fractured, corrupted by old money, and unwilling to actually risk their comfortable lives in a physical confrontation. To actually launch a successful rebellion, Castro needed men who possessed no ties to the disgraced political establishment, men whose unwavering loyalty belonged to the radical ideology of the movement itself. But organizing a civilian militia was useless without the physical, lethal hardware required to combat a professional, American-backed military, presenting a terrifying logistical hurdle. Because the movement was devoid of foreign funding or wealthy corporate sponsors, Castro and Santamara were forced to quietly, desperately purchase civilian weapons one at a time from local sporting goods stores and private collectors. They slowly, methodically accumulated a pathetic, inadequate arsenal of small-caliber hunting rifles, heavy, outdated pump-action shotguns, and .22 caliber target pistols unsuited for modern military combat. To maintain operational secrecy, they rented a quiet, isolated poultry farm called Villa Siboney, located just outside the eastern city of Santiago de Cuba, operating it as a disguised staging ground for the impending assault. They smuggled their inadequate cache of weapons and 10,000 rounds of civilian ammunition across the island by hiding them inside massive, heavy wooden chicken coops. Bypassing the routine, aggressive military checkpoints on the Central Highway, Castro's ultimate, classified military objective was not a small, quiet police station in the capital, but the massive fortified Moncada Barracks, the second largest military fortress in the entire country, housing over 1,000 armed, trained professional soldiers. The strategic, geographical logic behind targeting Moncada was brilliant, calculated, and rooted in the specific, unique history of the surrounding Oriente province. Santiago de Cuba was located over 500 miles away from the massive reinforced armored divisions stationed in Havana, ensuring that Batista could not easily deploy heavy reinforcements during the initial chaotic hours of an uprising. Furthermore, the massive fortress sat directly at the foothills of the sprawling, impenetrable Sierra Maestra mountain range, providing the rebels with a strategic, unmapped escape route if the assault failed. Castro's plan was audacious, relying on the element of surprise to overrun the sleeping garrison, seize the massive modern armory inside, and immediately broadcast a pre-recorded message calling the entire eastern province to general revolution. To achieve this impossible level of infiltration, the movement required authentic disguises, leading Santa Mara to quietly, methodically purchase yards of heavy, yellow khaki fabric, paying a sympathetic local tailor to secretly sew over 100 exact replicas of the standard Cuban military uniform. The specific, calculated timing of the assault was set for the early, quiet hours of July 26, 1953, a date chosen specifically to exploit the massive, chaotic distractions of the annual Santiago de Cuba Carnival. Castro knew that the city would be flooded with thousands of drunken, exhausted revelers, the streets would be littered with debris, and the vast majority of the professional soldiers inside Moncada would be hungover or asleep after nights of heavy, uninterrupted partying. In the sweltering, tense hours just before dawn, exactly 160 sweating, terrified young men gathered quietly inside the cramped, humid rooms of the Siboney farm, clutching their hunting rifles and waiting for the final order. Castro stood before his civilian army, looking directly into the eyes of the young clerks and mechanics he was about to lead into fortified military combat, and delivered a short, serious final directive. He explicitly, sternly commanded his men that under no circumstances were they allowed to execute prisoners, strictly forbidding the use of unnecessary brutality, and reminding them that they were fighting to restore the dignity of the Republic, not to become murderers. The rebels quietly climbed into a conspicuous, vulnerable convoy of 16 rented civilian sedans, disguised in their starched, brightly colored yellow military uniforms, and began the tense, fateful drive toward the sleeping fortress. The tactical execution of the raid, which had relied upon precise timing and undetected infiltration, began to catastrophically disintegrate before the first car even reached the heavy iron gates of the barracks. The initial vanguard of the convoy successfully approached the main gate, quietly disarming the confused, sleep-deprived sentries who mistook the disguised rebels for returning high-ranking military officers. But precisely at that critical moment, a random, unexpected two-man military patrol wandered directly into the path of Castro's trailing vehicle, immediately recognizing the suspicious nature of the armed civilian cars. The sudden, unexpected encounter triggered a massive, chaotic, premature firefight directly outside the heavy concrete walls of the fortress, instantly destroying the vital element of surprise. The deafening, lethal crack of heavy machine gun fire shattered the quiet, humid morning air, instantly waking the hundreds of armed, trained soldiers sleeping in the massive barracks surrounding the central courtyard. The situation instantly compounded into a massive, irreversible logistical nightmare when the specific, loaded Oldsmobile sedan carrying the movement's few heavy machine guns and the critical scaling ladders lost its way in the unfamiliar, winding colonial streets of Santiago. Without the heavy suppressing fire or the physical ability to scale the high concrete walls guarding the rear of the fortress, the civilian rebels were pinned down in the exposed, vulnerable open streets surrounding the base. The military execution of the assault disintegrated into a chaotic, fragmented urban firefight, failing to achieve a single one of its primary logistical objectives within the first 10 minutes of combat. Castro, pinned down behind his rented sedan, and watching his inadequate hunting rifles fail to penetrate the thick, reinforced concrete walls of the military fortress, realized with cold, terrifying clarity that the raid was an unmitigated tactical disaster. Operating with sudden, pragmatic instinct for basic human survival, he desperately ordered the chaotic retreat, shouting for his surviving men to abandon their positions, scatter into the confusing streets of the city, and run for the protective cover of the mountains. But the true, horrifying historical significance of the Moncada assault did not occur during the brief, disorganized 15 minutes of actual, active combat outside the gates of the fortress. The profound, permanent geopolitical shift occurred in the dark, blood-soaked aftermath, triggered by the brutal, emotional, unrestrained reaction of Fulgencio Batista's humiliated military commanders. General Martuendisa das Tamayo, the senior military officer dispatched by Batista to secure the panicked region, arrived in Santiago and delivered a cold, terrifying, illegal verbal directive to his armed troops. He explicitly ordered that for every single professional soldier killed by the rebels during the morning firefight, the military was required to summarily execute exactly 10 of the captured, unarmed, civilian prisoners. The Cuban military, enraged and unleashed from any semblance of constitutional restraint, began systematically hunting down the fleeing rebels, dragging them back into the dark, stained interior courtyards of the Moncada Barracks. What followed was a horrifying, systematically organized massacre that stripped the Batista dictatorship of its carefully maintained, polished illusion of legal legitimacy and civilized military order. Abel Santamara Castro's quiet, intelligent second-in-command was captured, dragged into the interrogation rooms, and brutally, illegally tortured to death by the military police, who desperately sought to extract the locations of the surviving leadership. Over 50 captured, defenseless members of the movement were systematically tortured, lined up against the heavy concrete walls, and executed without a single formal charge, a trial, or the slightest shred of legal due process. The military commanders, attempting to hide their illegal war crimes from the suspicious public, carefully staged the mutilated bodies of the executed prisoners throughout the fortress, falsely claiming they had died in active combat. But the sheer, undeniable brutality of the retaliation leaked out of the barracks, horrifying the conservative, influential civilian population of Santiago de Cuba, who had originally viewed the rebel attack as a foolish, dangerous act of treason. The citizens of the city, repulsed by the sudden visible reality of state-sponsored torture, suddenly shifted their underlying sympathies toward the young, persecuted rebels starving in the surrounding mountains. This profound shift in public opinion triggered the authentic minor plot that ultimately saved Fidel Castro's life from the same brutal, extrajudicial execution that his comrades had suffered. The respected influential Archbishop of Santiago, Enrique P. Erez Cervantes, publicly, fiercely intervened, utilizing the moral authority of the Catholic Church to demand an immediate halt to the military massacres. The Archbishop personally rode directly into the dense, forested foothills of the Sierra Maestra, securing a public, guaranteed promise from the military that if Castro surrendered, his physical safety and his right to a legal trial would be protected. When the exhausted, starving, surrounded Castro finally surrendered to a small, disciplined military patrol, the commanding officer, influenced by the Archbishop's public decree, refused to execute the rebel leader on the spot, choosing instead to quietly transport him to the civilian jail. This specific, narrow margin of survival altered the trajectory of the entire 20th century, leaving the articulate, ambitious lawyer alive, imprisoned, and ready to face a public national trial. From a strictly military, analytical perspective, the assault on the Moncada Barracks was an unmitigated catastrophe, resulting in the destruction of the rebel force, the loss of all weapons, and the tragic, violent death of Castro's closest friends. But from a strategic geopolitical perspective, the spectacular failure of the assault accomplished the fundamental political objective that the young lawyer had originally sought. He had successfully forced the Batista dictatorship to publicly, violently reveal its brutal nature to the entire Cuban population, stripping away the polite, diplomatic facade of the military regime. By overreacting and brutally executing dozens of unarmed prisoners, the government had inadvertently transformed a small, disorganized gang of unknown civilians into the vanguard of a powerful, emotional national resistance movement. Fidel Castro had marched into the city as an obscure, frustrated lawyer, but he was slowly, securely transported back to the capital as a guarded political prisoner, prepared to turn the machinery of the state's legal system against itself. When a militarized state attempts to neutralize a political dissident through the formal machinery of the judicial system, it inadvertently provides the dissident with a visible, protected public platform. Fulgencio Batista's compromised legal advisors failed to recognize this fundamental paradox when they formally indicted Fidel Castro and the surviving rebels of the Moncada assault. They assumed that a massive publicized criminal trial in the guarded Palace of Justice in Santiago de Cuba would serve as the ultimate, humiliating final chapter for the disorganized rebellion. On September 21, 1953, exactly 122 guarded defendants were brought into the sprawling, ornate courtroom, surrounded by hundreds of armed military police, gripping fixed bayonets. Castro, operating within his legal rights as a registered attorney, refused the compromised state-appointed defense counsel, choosing instead to legally, actively represent himself. He did not approach the heavy wooden podium as a defeated, terrified prisoner begging the court for leniency, but rather as an aggressive, meticulously prepared prosecutor who was putting the dictatorship itself on trial. During the tense, chaotic cross-examinations, Castro methodically questioned the senior military officers who had been called by the state to testify against the rebels. Utilizing brilliant, rigid legal logic, he cornered the military commanders into contradicting their own official timelines, forcing them to publicly, inadvertently admit that dozens of rebels had been captured alive and summarily executed in the courtyard. The horrified civilian journalists sitting in the crowded gallery furiously scribbled down these guarded state secrets, instantly transforming the trial from a simple criminal proceeding into a massive, explosive public relations disaster for the military regime. The panicked military leadership, realizing that they were continuously losing the psychological war on live national radio, quickly forced the intimidated judges to sever Castro from the main trial. The government issued a fabricated, cynical medical report claiming that the rebel leader was suffering from extreme physical exhaustion and was too ill to continue attending the daily proceedings. Castro, confined to his jail cell and anticipating this exact bureaucratic maneuver, quietly managed to write a detailed, fiercely defiant letter on a smuggled scrap of paper, explicitly proving that he was in perfect health and eager to testify. When this smuggled letter was unexpectedly, dramatically read aloud in the open courtroom by a sympathetic defense attorney, the military tribunal was humiliated, but they rigidly maintained the illegal separation. Instead of returning him to the massive public palace of justice, the military quietly convened a secret, isolated special tribunal on October 16th inside a tiny, guarded nurses' lounge at the Santiago Civil Hospital. The physical dimensions of this improvised courtroom were claustrophobic, measuring barely a few square meters, packed with over 100 armed soldiers who blocked the exits and intimidated the 3 sitting judges. Only 6 vetted, Monitored civilian journalists were allowed into the tiny room, explicitly forbidden by the military commanders from taking a single photograph or writing down a single note during the proceedings. It was within this constrained, weaponized physical space that Fidel Castro delivered a structured, intensely philosophical, 4-hour legal defense from memory, without the aid of a single written note. He began by rigorously, systematically dissecting the specific laws of the Cuban Penal Code, explicitly demonstrating that the military coup executed by Batista had destroyed the constitutional framework, thereby rendering the current government legally illegitimate. Drawing upon his massive retained knowledge of global political history, Castro quoted directly from the philosophical treatises of Thomas Aquinas, John Locke, and the American Declaration of Independence, arguing that armed rebellion against a violent tyranny was an entrenched fundamental human right. He leaned heavily into the specific, revered text of Article 40 of the suspended 1940 Cuban Constitution, which explicitly granted the citizens the unquestionable legal right to physically resist any government that usurped national sovereignty. He carefully, strategically utilized this isolated hospital room to officially, permanently establish the foundational political platform of his movement, laying out 5 specific, detailed revolutionary laws that he would have immediately enacted had the Moncada assault succeeded. He explicitly promised massive sweeping agrarian reform for the impoverished rural peasants, ensuring that the hundreds of thousands of landless farmers would finally secure the legal deeds to the soil they worked. He aggressively demanded the immediate reinstatement of the progressive 1940 Constitution, the swift, unapologetic confiscation of all illegally acquired political wealth, and the mandatory sharing of industrial profits with the Cuban working class. By rigorously detailing this specific, tangible political manifesto, he elevated the Moncada assault from a foolish, violent military blunder into a noble, structured crusade for national justice. He stripped the military dictatorship of its carefully constructed narrative, proving with cold logic that the young men who died at Moncada were not terrorists, but the true defenders of the Cuban Republic. He concluded this exhausting 4-hour oratorical masterclass with a simple, profoundly defiant closing statement, looking directly at the intimidated judges and stating that they could condemn him, but history would ultimately absolve him. The judges, pressured by the military guards standing directly behind them, quickly found Castro guilty of organizing an armed uprising against the state, sentencing him to 15 years of hard labor in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The Batista regime quietly transferred Castro to the massive, intimidating Presidio Modelo, or model prison, located on the isolated, humid Isle of Pines, off the southern coast of the Cuban mainland. The prison was a terrifyingly precise architectural manifestation of the panopticon design, consisting of 4 enormous, circular concrete cell blocks centered around a single darkened central observation tower. This psychological design ensured that the armed guards could constantly, invisibly monitor every single movement of the thousands of inmates, creating an atmosphere of unrelenting paranoia and physical subjugation. Castro was separated from the rest of the surviving Moncada rebels and placed into isolated, restrictive solitary confinement in a small, fortified cell in the hospital wing of the prison. But the dictatorship fatally misunderstood the resilient psychological architecture of their most dangerous political prisoner, assuming that profound isolation and heavy censorship would ultimately break his spirit and erase him from the national memory. Instead, Castro methodically, aggressively transformed his tiny, sweltering prison cell into a disciplined political academy, ordering hundreds of intellectual books through the censored prison mail system. He spent hours meticulously studying the complex, strategic writings of Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, William Shakespeare, and Immanuel Kant, refining his political philosophy and hardening his uncompromising resolve. He understood that the powerful, articulate 4-hour speech he had delivered in the tiny hospital room was useless if the Cuban public never actually read its specific, radical proposals. This stark, pragmatic realization led him to immediately devise a brilliant, clandestine logistical operation designed to bypass the rigorous, unyielding military censorship that governed every single communication leaving the island prison. Relying entirely on his massive retentive memory, Castro painstakingly reconstructed the entire complex text of history, Will Absolve Me, over the course of several tense, focused months in solitary confinement. To bypass the relentless surveillance of the military censors who meticulously read every single piece of outbound mail, he utilized a simple, effective chemical technique relying on the acidic properties of basic lime and lemon juice. He would write ordinary, mundane letters to his political supporters on the outside, discussing trivial matters and family news using standard visible blue ink provided by the prison guards. But in the narrow spaces between those visible lines, Castro would use a small, tightly rolled piece of cotton soaked in lemon juice to carefully, meticulously write the subversive, explosive text of his political manifesto. When the invisible, acidic juice dried into the rough fibers of the paper, the letters appeared innocuous to the bored, unobservant military censors who routinely stamped them for standard approval. These coded letters were quietly mailed to two crucial, loyal women of the movement, Melba Hernandez and Heidi Santamara, who had participated in the Moncada assault but had already been released after serving brief, 7-month prison sentences. Operating in the dangerous shadows of Havana, these two women would take the mundane prison letters and carefully, methodically press a heated clothes iron directly over the thick, fibrous paper. The intense, concentrated heat would rapidly oxidize the invisible traces of the citrus acid, causing the hidden text of Castro's manifesto to slowly, magically bloom into a readable dark brown script across the page. The sheer logistical tension of this clandestine operation cannot be overstated, as Hernandez and Santamara worked relentlessly under the constant, real threat of immediate military execution if the dictator's secret police ever raided their apartment. They slowly, painstakingly transcribed the massive, complex text entirely by hand, compiling the fragmented, acidic letters into a unified political document that perfectly captured the exact tone of the hospital room trial. Once the text was assembled, they faced the dangerous logistical hurdle of securing the funding required to operate a hidden, illegal underground printing press capable of mass-producing the pamphlet. They quietly, desperately solicited small, secretive donations from sympathetic middle-class professionals, lawyers, and frustrated university professors who resonated with the constitutional, legalistic arguments of Castro's smuggled defense. Utilizing these clandestine funds, they successfully, quietly manufactured over 10,000 small, easily concealable pamphlet copies of the reconstructed speech, avoiding the watchful surveillance of the state police. These explosive, illegal pamphlets were quietly, systematically distributed across the entire island, flooding the universities, the crowded tobacco factories, and the quiet, impoverished rural villages of the Oriente province. The coordinated distribution of this manifesto was an unmitigated disaster for the Batista dictatorship, shattering their curated narrative that Castro was nothing more than a violent, disorganized criminal. The Cuban people read the articulate, compassionate, and fiercely structured political platform, transforming the isolated, guarded political prisoner into the unquestionable moral epicenter of the anti-Batista resistance. Every single time a university student or a disgruntled factory worker secretly passed the worn pamphlet to a trusted friend, the embedded, invisible network of the rebellion grew substantially stronger. The 15-year prison sentence, explicitly designed to silence and permanently bury the young lawyer, had actually functioned as a fortified political incubator, protecting him from the active, lethal military death squads roaming the streets of Havana. By legally locking him away on an isolated island, Batista had inadvertently provided Castro with the necessary time and psychological space required to forge the ideological foundation of the 26th of July movement. The inescapable irony of the Presidio Modelo was that while the military guards constantly, aggressively patrolled the high concrete walls to keep the prisoner securely locked inside, they failed to keep his dangerous ideas from escaping. Castro's focused period of philosophical incubation on the Isle of Pines refined his raw, emotional outrage into a cold, calculating, strategic vision for national revolution. The tension across the island continued to steadily, relentlessly build, as the undeniable logic of Castro's smuggled words infected the minds of a generation starved for authentic, uncompromised political leadership. Batista, sitting securely in his guarded presidential palace, remained tragically unaware that the tiny, invisible drops of lemon juice slowly drying in a prison cell were actively, permanently dismantling the psychological foundation of his entire regime. The dictator believed that he had successfully, permanently neutralized his articulate, dangerous opponent, failing to realize that he had merely provided the young rebel with the ultimate martyrdom required to unify a fractured nation. When a military dictator seeks to permanently legitimize his illegal seizure of power on the global stage, he is often forced to make calculated, dangerous political concessions. By the spring of 1955, Fulgencio Batista firmly believed that he had crushed the physical infrastructure of the Cuban resistance, pacifying the volatile urban centers of the island. Seeking to attract massive foreign investment and project a polished facade of democratic stability to the United States government, Batista decided to hold an orchestrated, uncontested general election. To complete this carefully manufactured illusion of national reconciliation, the dictator yielded to a massive, public civilian petition campaign organized by the mothers of political prisoners, officially signing a sweeping amnesty law on May 15th. Fidel Castro and the surviving Moncada rebels were immediately released from the massive concrete walls of the Presidio Modelo, boarding a ferry back to the Cuban mainland under the flashing bulbs of the national press. Batista's political advisors operated under the strict, flawed logical assumption that Castro was a defeated, marginalized figure who would quietly fade into obscurity once stripped of his martyrdom. They failed to understand that the 22 months of isolated imprisonment had not broken the young lawyer, but rather functioned as a secure, state-sponsored incubator for his radical political ideology. Almost immediately upon arriving at the central train station in Havana, Castro was mobbed by thousands of energized, vocal supporters, instantly proving to the regime that the amnesty was a catastrophic miscalculation. Within weeks of his release, the state-controlled military police began a coordinated, relentless campaign of physical intimidation, actively suppressing Castro's radio broadcasts, violently breaking up his public rallies, and openly trailing his vehicle through the streets of the capital. Castro recognized the stark, undeniable logistical reality that the Batista regime would never allow him to peacefully organize a political opposition, and that remaining in Havana would inevitably result in his quiet, extrajudicial assassination in a dark alleyway. Operating with a cold, pragmatic instinct for organizational survival, Castro made the explicit decision to abandon the island, securing a tourist visa and boarding a commercial flight to Veracruz, Mexico. On July 7, 1955, Mexico City in the mid-20th century operated as a vast, tolerant political sanctuary, serving as the ultimate, densely populated safe haven for exiled revolutionaries. displaced intellectuals, and hunted political dissidents from across the hemisphere. Castro quickly rented a series of cheap, inconspicuous apartments spread across the sprawling Mexican capital, establishing the central, clandestine headquarters for his newly formalized organization, the 26th of July movement. But launching a massive seaborne, armed invasion of a fortified island requires an astronomical amount of physical capital, a logistical hurdle that forced Castro to immediately pivot his attention toward the wealthy, populated Cuban diaspora living in the United States. In the autumn of 1955, Castro embarked on a public strategic fundraising tour across the eastern seaboard, systematically speaking to packed, emotional crowds of Cuban exiles in New York, Tampa, and Miami. He ruthlessly leveraged his rising political celebrity to solicit thousands of small individual cash donations from working-class tobacco workers and expatriate mechanics, quietly amassing the hard currency required to purchase military-grade weaponry. In a brilliant, cynical display of political pragmatism, Castro also secretly arranged a meeting with Carlos Pare o Socars, the corrupt, recently ousted Cuban president who was living in luxurious exile in Miami, despite harboring profound, documented political disgust for the ousted politician. Castro quietly, strategically accepted a massive cash donation of $50,000 from Pare, utilizing the corrupt money of the old republic to fund the weapons that would ultimately destroy it, while Castro was actively securing the financial architecture of the impending invasion. A profound, historically pivotal ideological fusion was quietly taking place back in the crowded, humid apartments of Mexico City. Fidel's younger brother, Raul Castro, who had accompanied him into exile, introduced him to a 27-year-old asthmatic, itinerant Argentine physician who was currently making a meager living taking photographs of tourists in local parks. This young doctor was Ernesto Guevara, a man who had just spent the last several years traveling extensively across the impoverished, exploited indigenous regions of Latin America, undergoing a massive, irreversible political radicalization. Guevara's uncompromising ideological worldview had been definitively forged just 1 year prior, in 1954. During a specific, authentic geopolitical crisis unfolding in the Central American nation of Guatemala. He had been living in Guatemala City, actively supporting the democratically elected progressive government of Jacobo Arbenz, who had attempted to institute sweeping agrarian land reforms that directly threatened the massive profit margins of the American-owned United Fruit Company. Guevara watched with profound clinical horror as the United States Central Intelligence Agency explicitly organized, funded, and logistically directed a brutal military coup that overthrew the Arbenz government. The specific, tangible historical lesson that Guevara extracted from the ashes of the Guatemalan coup was that the entrenched capitalist military establishment would never, under any circumstances, allow a peaceful democratic transition towards socialism. He witnessed the Guatemalan army betray its own president, leading him to the rigorous logical conclusion that a successful revolution could not simply reform the existing military apparatus, but must violently dismantle it from the ground up. When Fidel Castro and Ernesto Guevara finally met on a warm July evening, inside the small, unassuming apartment of a Cuban exile named Maria Antonia Gonzalez, the conversation fundamentally altered the geopolitical trajectory of the 20th century. They sat at a small kitchen table, drinking heavy, bitter coffee and debating military strategy, revolutionary philosophy, and Latin American history for 10 continuous, uninterrupted hours until the sun slowly rose over the Mexican capital. Castro brought to the table a massive magnetic, fiercely Cuban nationalism, possessing the unparalleled organizational brilliance and unrelenting physical momentum required to actually execute an armed uprising. Guevara, who would quickly adopt the ubiquitous nickname Che, brought a cold, intellectual, rigidly Marxist framework, possessing structural understanding of global imperialism and the ruthless, tactical necessity of unconventional guerrilla warfare. Che recognized immediately that Castro was the specific catalyst he had been searching for, a man unburdened by the theoretical, cautious paralysis that plagued the traditional orthodox communist parties of Latin America. Castro recognized that the Argentine doctor possessed unwavering willingness to die for his convictions, an incorruptible moral rigidity that made him the perfect, trusted lieutenant for the impending invasion. With the core leadership intact and the initial funding securely smuggled across the border, the movement faced the dangerous logistical reality of transforming a disorganized group of exiled civilians into a disciplined, lethal military vanguard. Castro sought out the specialized expertise of Colonel Alberto Bayo, a seasoned, one-eyed veteran of the Spanish Civil War who possessed technical mastery of irregular guerrilla tactics. Bayo was initially skeptical of the young, opinionated Cuban lawyer, but Castro utilized his massive, persuasive charisma to convince the aging veteran to serve as the chief military instructor for the rebel army. The movement quietly, strategically rented the Santa Rosa Ranch, a sprawling, isolated, rugged property located in the mountainous Chalco district, situated outside the watchful jurisdiction of the Mexico City police forces. Operating under the strict, uncompromising command of Colonel Bayo, the exiled Cubans underwent a brutal, realistic, relentlessly physical military training regimen designed to break their civilian habits and forge iron discipline. They spent their days enduring gruelingly long, weighted marches through the steep, forested terrain, deliberately starving themselves for days at a time to slowly acclimate their bodies to the brutal, inescapable reality of jungle survival. Bayo methodically instructed them in the technical, lethal arts of tactical camouflage, coordinated ambush mechanics, and the precise, chemical manufacturing of improvised explosive devices using standard, accessible agricultural materials. Che Guevara, despite suffering from crippling, aggressive asthma attacks that frequently left him gasping for air on the dirt floor of the ranch, consistently achieved the highest marks in tactical marksmanship and strategic troop deployment. This grueling, isolated preparation continued smoothly for several months, actively transforming the exiles from a chaotic political organization into a lean, capable paramilitary unit focused on the liberation of Cuba. But the Batista dictatorship had not simply forgotten about Fidel Castro, possessing a massive, funded network of military intelligence officers and paid informants actively operating within the sprawling Cuban exile community in Mexico. The Cuban embassy continuously pressured the highest levels of the Mexican government to actively investigate the movement, quietly slipping padded envelopes of cash to local police commanders to secure their aggressive cooperation. This organized, funded espionage campaign culminated in a specific dangerous minor plot that derailed the timeline of the invasion and very nearly resulted in the total, permanent destruction of the rebel leadership. On June 21, 1956, armed agents of the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, the feared secretive Mexican secret police, executed a sudden, coordinated raid on several suspected rebel safe houses in Mexico City. Captain Fernando Gutierrez Barrios, the capable analytical Mexican intelligence officer commanding the operation, personally arrested Fidel Castro on the street, immediately shoving a heavy-loaded pistol directly into the rebel leader's spine. The Mexican police systematically swept through the city, detaining Che Guevara, rounding up over 20 key members of the movement, and uncovering a massive concealed cache of illegal, military-grade automatic weapons. Castro found himself locked inside a cold, guarded Mexican detention cell, facing the horrifying reality that the weapons he had spent a year desperately funding were now permanently sitting in a police evidence locker. More terrifying than the loss of the arsenal was the immediate diplomatic maneuvering by the Batista regime, who formally, aggressively requested that the Mexican government immediately deport the captured rebels back to Havana. Castro knew with total logistical certainty that if he were placed on an airplane back to Cuba, Batista's military police would simply drag him out to the tarmac and execute him before he ever reached a courtroom. Operating from within the confines of his jail cell, Castro executed a brilliant, calculated political maneuver, instructing his remaining free operatives to leak the entire story of the arrest to the sympathetic Mexican press. He actively framed the detention not as a standard criminal weapons charge, but as a corrupt, political persecution orchestrated by a foreign dictator bribing sovereign Mexican law enforcement officials. To neutralize the imminent threat of deportation, Castro called upon the influential political capital of Lizardo Cárdenas, a revered, progressive former president of Mexico who possessed massive moral authority within the government. Cárdenas, sympathetic to the anti-imperialist, nationalist goals of the Cuban exiles, formally intervened behind closed doors, applying specific political pressure directly upon the sitting Mexican president to prevent the extradition. The Mexican authorities, embarrassed by the sudden negative media attention and unwilling to anger the powerful Cárdenas faction, ultimately concluded that they lacked strict legal evidence required to maintain prolonged detention. On July 24th, after a grueling, uncertain month in captivity, Che Guevara and the remaining rebels were officially released from custody, ordered by the state to abandon their political activities and prepare to leave the country. The release was a profound political victory, but it shattered the carefully maintained operational security of the movement, exposing their active logistical presence to the watchful eyes of Batista's international assassins. Castro realized that the timeline for the invasion could no longer be dictated by military readiness or tactical perfection, but was now governed by the rapidly closing window of their physical survival in Mexico. He explicitly ordered his logistical coordinators to immediately locate and purchase a seaworthy vessel, disregarding the specific size or condition of the ship in favor of immediate availability. They quietly located an aging, weathered, 58-foot wooden recreational cabin cruiser moored in the quiet port of Tuxpan, a vessel originally designed to hold a maximum capacity of 12 passengers for short, leisurely weekend fishing trips. The owner of the yacht, a sympathetic American expatriate, agreed to quietly sell the vessel to the rebels for exactly $15,000, transferring the title of the ship that bore a simple, unassuming English name printed across its stern. The yacht was named Granma, and it was spectacularly unfit for the massive, dangerous, turbulent open ocean crossing required to reach the treacherous, guarded southern coast of the Cuban mainland. The rebels spent the tense final weeks of October desperately stockpiling whatever replacement weapons they could quietly acquire on the black market, rapidly loading heavy crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and standard military rations into the cramped, leaking hull of the ship. Castro issued the final secret mobilization orders, directing exactly 82 armed men to quietly converge on the muddy, isolated banks of the Tuxpan River under the cover of freezing darkness. As the men systematically squeezed themselves into the tiny, overloaded wooden cabin, standing shoulder to shoulder in silence, the undeniable logistical absurdity of the operation became starkly, terrifyingly apparent. They were 82 seasick civilians, armed with mismatched rifles lacking naval combat experience, Preparing to cross the Gulf of Mexico in a leaking recreational yacht to wage war against a professional military of 80,000 men. Yet, standing on the small wooden deck as the heavy diesel engines sputtered into life on November 25, 1956, Fidel Castro possessed unwavering conviction in the mathematical certainty of his own victory. He had transformed a massive public legal defeat in Cuba into the ideological bedrock of a national movement, and he had maneuvered a disastrous police raid in Mexico into a daring, dramatic escape. The heavy, rotting wooden hull of the Granma slowly slipped its mooring lines, disappearing into the dark, churning waters of the ocean, carrying the condensed future of the Cuban Republic directly into the eye of an armed storm. When you attempt to secretly launch an armed invasion of an island nation, the vast, unforgiving expanse of the open ocean becomes your very first lethal adversary. The Granma was originally designed to comfortably accommodate 12 passengers, but as it slowly navigated the dark, muddy waters of the Tuxpan River, it was carrying exactly 82 armed men, massive steel drums of extra diesel fuel, and heavy wooden crates of military-grade ammunition. The undeniable physics of this massive logistical overload immediately forced the aging wooden hull of the yacht deep into the water. Resting dangerously close to the turbulent, unpredictable surface of the Gulf of Mexico, the voyage began on November 25, 1956. Under the protective cover of a massive churning cold front that the Mexican meteor, Fidel Castro ignored these specific naval warnings, choosing instead to utilize the violent, freezing storm as a natural, impenetrable shield against the watchful, aggressive coastal patrols of the Mexican and Cuban navies. But the immediate physical consequence of navigating an overloaded, flat-bottomed recreational yacht directly into a massive winter storm was a profound, unavoidable outbreak of severe seasickness. Within hours of leaving the relatively calm waters of the river, the small, cramped cabin and the exposed wooden decks were covered in vomit. As armed men collapsed in debilitating physical agony, the rebels were unable to cook the standard military rations they had brought, surviving on small, rapidly depleting rations of sweetened condensed milk, dry crackers, and whatever rainwater they could desperately catch in their canteens. Compounding this immense visceral human suffering was a severe specific mechanical failure that altered the strict, calculated strategic timeline of the entire invasion. The Granma's right engine suffered a severely damaged clutch, preventing the vessel from achieving its maximum cruising speed, reducing the burdened yacht to a slow, agonizing crawl across the violent, churning waters. This severe reduction in speed shattered the massive, coordinated strategic synchronization that Castro had spent months meticulously organizing with the urban underground resistance back in Cuba. Castro had explicitly coordinated the naval landing to coincide perfectly with a massive, organized urban uprising in the city of Santiago de Cuba, scheduled precisely for November 30th. The tactical logic behind this synchronized assault was brilliant, relying on the urban rebels to violently attack local police stations and distract the heavy armored divisions of Batista's military. This massive distraction was designed to draw the military's attention toward the city, providing the Granma with a quiet, undefended coastal window to land, unload its heavy weapons, and disappear into the mountains. On the morning of November 30th, Frank Parr seized the dedicated, capable 22-year-old schoolteacher who commanded the 26th of July movement's urban underground, executed his orders with flawless, lethal precision. Paz led hundreds of young, armed civilians into the steep colonial streets of Santiago, successfully capturing the National Police headquarters, burning the customs house, and paralyzing the city's military infrastructure. For several tense, violent hours, the urban rebels proudly flew the red and black flag of the movement over the city, desperately scanning the southern horizon for the anticipated arrival of the Granma. But the yacht was still hundreds of miles away, battling the massive waves of the Gulf, unable to communicate its severe mechanical delays due to a broken, waterlogged radio transmitter. When Batista's military commanders realized that the urban uprising was an isolated event, they quickly, ruthlessly deployed heavy armored reinforcements, crushing the rebellion and forcing Paz and his surviving men to scatter into the guarded urban underground. The massive, tragic consequence of this broken synchronization was that instead of distracting the military, the failed uprising placed the entire armed forces of the Oriente province on a state of maximum alert. Batista's coastal radar stations, naval destroyers, and armed reconnaissance aircraft were actively scouring the southern coastline, aware that an organized rebel operation was underway. Meanwhile, the situation aboard the Granma was rapidly deteriorating from a severe logistical delay into a desperate critical battle for physical survival. The relentless pounding of the massive waves had severely weakened the aging wooden planks of the hull, causing the yacht to take on freezing seawater at an alarming rate. The bilge pumps failed, forcing the exhausted, seasick rebels to form desperate, frantic bucket brigades, manually bailing heavy, dark water out of the lower cabins simply to prevent the vessel from sinking. In the deep, freezing darkness of December 1st, a specific, terrifying minor plot unfolded that perfectly demonstrated Castro's uncompromising authority and his psychological commitment to his men. Roberto Roque, a former Cuban naval officer serving as the primary navigator, climbed onto the precarious, slippery roof of the cabin to desperately scan the dark horizon for the faint, necessary glow of the Cabo Cruz lighthouse. The yacht suddenly pitched violently in a massive wave, throwing Roque off the roof and plunging him directly into the freezing, pitch black waters of the Gulf of Mexico. In standard naval doctrine, turning an overloaded, mechanically impaired vessel around in the middle of a massive winter storm to search for a single man in the dark is considered a dangerous, nearly impossible maneuver. But Castro firmly, explicitly ordered the captain to immediately halt the invasion, refusing to leave a single member of his loyal vanguard to die alone in the ocean. For nearly an hour, the Granma circled desperately in the dark, heavy waves, burning precious, limited diesel fuel, while the rebels swept the black water with a single, inadequate flashlight. When they finally miraculously located Roque and pulled his freezing, exhausted body back onto the deck, the men experienced a profound surge of psychological loyalty toward a commander who had risked the entire revolution to save one soldier. But this emotional, successful rescue cost them valuable time and precious fuel, destroying their ability to precisely navigate toward their designated, secure landing zone at Niquero. At dawn on December 2nd, the exhausted navigator realized they were off course, lost along a treacherous, unmapped section of the southern coastline known as Las Coloradas. The yacht suddenly, violently shuddered and slammed directly into a massive, concealed underwater sandbar, grounding the vessel exactly 100 yards away from the dense, forested shoreline. The rebels were trapped in the open water, unable to steer the boat closer to the beach, and exposed to the active armed coastal patrols of the Cuban military. To make the situation exponentially worse, they were spotted by a small civilian coastal transport vessel, which immediately reported their exact, vulnerable coordinates directly to Batista's naval headquarters. Recognizing the imminent, lethal threat of a military airstrike, Castro explicitly ordered the men to abandon the grounded yacht, forcing them to jump directly into the deep, heavy, chest-high water. The landing was not a triumphant, organized military beachhead. It was a desperate, chaotic scramble for basic physical survival in one of the most hostile, impenetrable ecosystems on the entire island. The shoreline at Las Coloradas was not a pristine, sandy beach, but a massive, dense mangrove swamp, characterized by thick, intertwined, razor-sharp roots rising out of deep, toxic, viscous mud. The rebels were forced to abandon their heavy, necessary anti-tank weapons, their heavy machine guns, and the vast majority of their crucial medical supplies, which simply sank into the dark, heavy water. They spent the next 4 hours agonizingly, desperately hacking their way through the massive, unforgiving mangrove roots, sinking up to their chests in thick, suffocating mud, unable to move quickly or establish a defensive perimeter. When they finally dragged their exhausted, bleeding bodies onto solid ground, they were isolated, having lost nearly all of their heavy equipment, their food rations, and the vital element of surprise. For the next 3 days, the fragmented, exhausted rebel force desperately, aimlessly marched through the dense, heavy coastal sugarcane fields, lacking a coherent map, clean drinking water, or a clear, secure destination. The men were forced to aggressively chew on raw, heavy sugarcane stalks simply to extract unrefined moisture, rapidly inducing severe, debilitating stomach cramps and physical exhaustion. Their heavy, impractical leather boots shredded their waterlogged, blistered feet, reducing the once disciplined, trained paramilitary force to a slow, limping procession of starving civilians. Batista's military commanders, operating with precise, accurate intelligence on the rebels' location, methodically, aggressively established a massive, fortified perimeter, trapping the rebels inside a rapidly shrinking armed box. On the afternoon of December 5th, the exhausted rebel column paused to rest in a small, exposed clearing known as Alagar de Porcido, which translates with bitter irony to the joy of the pious. They were unaware that the trusted local peasant guiding them through the heavy sugarcane fields was actively working as a paid informant for the local military garrison. As the rebels removed their heavy boots to tend to severely bleeding feet, resting quietly in the tall, obscuring sugarcane stalks, the lethal machinery of the Cuban military violently closed the trap. Without minimal warning, the quiet tropical air was brutally shattered by the deafening roar of low-flying, armed B-26 bomber aircraft directly overhead. The planes aggressively, methodically strafed the exposed sugarcane field with heavy 50-caliber machine gun fire and leveled surrounding tree lines with massive, explosive fragmentation bombs. Instantly following the devastating, chaotic airstrike, armed Cuban infantry units, holding overwhelming numerical superiority, launched a fierce, coordinated ground assault from 3 separate directions. The rebel encampment instantly disintegrated into lethal chaos, as panicked men frantically grabbed their rifles and fired blindly into dense, obscuring smoke and burning sugarcane. Incoming military fire was accurate and concentrated, rapidly cutting down exhausted rebels and preventing Castro from establishing any coherent, organized defensive line. During the intense, chaotic initial moments of the ambush, Che Guevara, serving as the primary combat medic, was violently struck in the neck by a heavy ricocheting bullet, collapsing backward into the thick dirt. Believing he had received a fatal wound, Guevara leaned against a massive tree trunk, fully preparing to bleed to death in the heavy, burning smoke of the sugarcane field. It was precisely in this desperate, isolated moment that Guevara faced a profound symbolic choice that encapsulated his entire ideological transformation. Lying in the dirt directly in front of him were 2 cumbersome items dropped by a fleeing comrade: a massive necessary canvas medical kit and a heavy, essential wooden box of rifle ammunition. Recognizing that his physical injuries severely limited his ability to carry both items, the bleeding doctor made a cold, calculated, permanent ideological decision. He deliberately abandoned the medical kit designed to save human lives, picked up the heavy wooden box of ammunition designed to end them, and dragged himself deeper into the thick, protective forest cover. This specific, authentic minor plot perfectly demonstrated Ernesto Guevara's transition from a compassionate civilian healer into a ruthless, hardened military combatant. The ambush at Alegria de Pipio was not a traditional structured military battle. It was a massive, efficient slaughter, designed to annihilate the exhausted rebel vanguard. Castro desperately shouting orders over the deafening, chaotic roar of burning sugarcane, realized his force was surrounded and facing total destruction. He issued the only pragmatic, desperate military order remaining, explicitly instructing surviving men to break into tiny, isolated groups of 2 or 3, abandon the main column, and scatter into the deep forest. For the next several days, the fragmented, starving survivors were relentlessly hunted by Batista's heavy military patrols, aided by compensated local informants who betrayed fleeing rebel hiding spots. Dozens of the educated young men who boarded the Granma with uncompromising visions of liberating the Republic were captured, dragged into dense brush, and summarily executed by the military without trial. The Batista regime quickly released confident press statements to global media, explicitly declaring the entire rebel force annihilated and Fidel Castro confirmed dead. To the outside world, the ambitious, audacious armed invasion of Cuba appeared to have ended exactly as it began, as a tragic, predictable tactical catastrophe. By mid-December, only a tiny, isolated fraction of the original 82 men had evaded the coordinated military dragnet and disappeared into the rugged foothills of the Sierra Maestra. They held no heavy weapons, no functioning radio equipment, no reliable supply lines, with a depleted force of exactly 21 starving, wounded men. Batista logically believed this tiny, pathetic remnant posed no legitimate military threat to his funded government, assuming the brutal jungle would quickly kill the survivors. But the dictator fatally misunderstood the resilient strategic architecture of the surviving leadership, failing to recognize that the most dangerous elements of the invasion had survived the slaughter. Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and Camilo Cienfuegos had all slipped through the armed perimeter, preserving the centralized ideological core of the entire revolution. They were no longer an organized, equipped invasion force, but the brutal, chaotic disaster at Alegria de Pipio had stripped away their civilian naivety, leaving a cold, hardened, pragmatic guerrilla core. The impenetrable jungle mountains rising sharply behind them offered a secure sanctuary, providing the exact geographic conditions required to rewrite the predictable rules of modern military combat. The catastrophic landing had destroyed their army, but it had placed Fidel Castro precisely where he needed to be, embedded within the rugged, isolated heart of the Cuban resistance. When a conventional military vanguard is shattered in an initial engagement, the surviving remnants face a stark historical precedent demanding either immediate surrender or permanent dispersal into civilian anonymity. The 21 men who staggered into the dense, rain-soaked canopy of the Sierra Maestra Mountains in late December 1956 rejected both of those traditional outcomes, opting instead to rebuild an army from zero. The physical topography of the Sierra Maestra mountain range in southeastern Cuba functions as a natural, impenetrable fortress stretching over 150 miles along the treacherous Caribbean coast. Rising sharply to an elevation of over 6,000 feet at Pico Taquino, the terrain consists of vertical limestone ravines, razor-sharp marra brush, and a suffocating double canopy jungle that blocks all direct sunlight. This hostile ecosystem became the operational laboratory for the survivors of the Granma expedition, forcing a rapid, brutal evolution from theoretical urban revolutionaries into hardened, pragmatic jungle insurgents. By the third week of December, the fragmented survivors navigated this punishing landscape by night, guided only by the faint light of the stars and the quiet assistance of sympathetic local farmers who risked execution to hide them. On December 18th, a critical historical convergence occurred at a remote, isolated sugarcane farm known as Cinco Palmas, located deep within the rugged district of Puriel de Vicana. Fidel Castro, accompanied by only two exhausted men, waited in the dark palm grove until his younger brother, Rael, emerged from the dense underbrush leading a separate, starving contingent of 4 survivors. Instead of mourning the catastrophic loss of the expeditionary force, or acknowledging the stark logistical nightmare of their situation, Castro embraced his brother and immediately demanded a strict physical inventory of their surviving armaments. Upon confirming that their combined military strength amounted to exactly 7 functioning rifles, Castro looked at the ragged, malnourished group and famously declared that the days of the dictatorship were numbered, stating that they would now win the war. This was not the delusional ranting of a broken commander, but a calculated, rigorously applied psychological tactic designed to instantly inoculate his surviving vanguard against the overwhelming despair of their tactical reality. Castro understood a fundamental law of asymmetric warfare, recognizing that as long as the supreme leadership remained alive and uncaptured, the political concept of the revolution remained viable in the minds of the Cuban public. Fulgencio Batista had already broadcast sweeping claims of their total annihilation across national radio networks, a fatal propaganda error that Castro recognized would eventually backfire the moment the rebels proved they were still breathing. To achieve this necessary resurrection, the tiny rebel band required a full logistical overhaul, pivoting their survival strategy away from external seaborne supply lines and anchoring it directly into the socio-economic fabric of the rural peasantry. The inhabitants of the Sierra Maestra, known as the Guajiros, were an impoverished, landless class of coffee growers and subsistence farmers who existed outside the legal and economic protections of the Cuban state. For generations, these peasants had been brutalized by Batista's rural guard, a corrupt paramilitary police force that routinely stole their livestock, burned their crops, and operated with unregulated extrajudicial impunity on behalf of absentee landlords. Castro recognized that winning the trust of the Guajiros was not merely a moral imperative, but the central, non-negotiable strategic requirement for securing food, intelligence, and safe passage through the unmapped terrain. He immediately instituted a draconian code of conduct among his fighters, dictating that every single piece of food, medicine, or equipment acquired from a local peasant must be paid for in cash at fair market value. Any rebel caught stealing from the local population, damaging civilian property, or demonstrating disrespect toward a rural family faced an immediate military tribunal and severe disciplinary action, including the possibility of execution. This rigid economic doctrine produced a profound geopolitical shift within the mountains. As the peasants slowly realized that this ragged band of armed strangers represented the first ethical authority figure they had ever encountered, the rebels began to function as an alternative state apparatus, utilizing Ernesto Che Guevara's medical expertise to provide free, unprecedented pediatric and dental care to rural families who had never seen a physician in their entire lives. Guevara himself faced a grueling physical adaptation, suffering from crippling asthma attacks exacerbated by the damp jungle air and a lack of adrenaline or epinephrine medication. Despite struggling to draw breath during steep, vertical ascents, Guevara refused to fall behind the main column, earning the quiet respect of the local farmers who witnessed his relentless physical endurance. This quiet accumulation of rural loyalty formed an invisible, impenetrable intelligence shield around the rebels, as local farmers eagerly served as scouts, warning Castro of any encroaching military patrols days before they arrived. However, surviving in the jungle required more than local goodwill. It required a steady influx of modern ammunition, replacement uniforms, and secure communication lines bridging the gap between the isolated mountains and the urban underground. This vital logistical pipeline was masterminded by Celia Sanchez, the daughter of a rural doctor in the coastal town of Manzanillo, who possessed an intimate encyclopedic knowledge of the Sierra Maestra topography. Operating under the constant threat of capture by Batista's secret police, Sanchez built a clandestine supply network, purchasing heavy canvas boots, condensed milk, and weapon parts in the lowlands. She systematically funneled these critical supplies up the mountain using a trusted network of local mule drivers and sympathetic merchants, functioning as the vital, beating heart of the rebel logistical infrastructure. By mid-January 1957, the Corps vanguard had swelled to 29 men, fortified by a steady trickle of urban recruits funneled through Sanchez's network, who had secretly navigated the military checkpoints to join the encampment. Recognizing that their prolonged silence was beginning to validate Batista's claims of their destruction, Castro determined that the time had come to execute a deliberate, targeted offensive strike against a conventional military position. They selected the small, isolated rural guard outpost at La Plata, located directly at the mouth of the La Plata River on the southern coast, garrisoned by 10 armed professional soldiers. The objective was not to capture territory, which they lacked the manpower to permanently hold, but to physically secure modern military weapons and transmit a clear, violent signal to Havana that the movement was operational. On the night of January 17th, guided by precise intelligence gathered from the local peasantry, the rebels surrounded the corrugated tin barracks and launched a coordinated surprise attack under the cover of darkness. Following a brief, intense exchange of heavy gunfire that resulted in 2 dead soldiers and several wounded, the surviving garrison surrendered, granting the rebels full access to the interior armory. The rebels meticulously catalogued their captured spoils, seizing 8 Springfield rifles, a Thompson submachine gun, a Browning automatic rifle, and over 1,000 rounds of military-grade ammunition, instantly doubling their effective firepower. Instead of executing the captured soldiers as traditional military logic and the brutal precedent of the Moncada aftermath might dictate, Castro implemented a radical, unorthodox psychological strategy that stunned the defeated garrison. He explicitly ordered Che Guevara to utilize the captured medical supplies to meticulously treat the gunshot wounds of the enemy soldiers, ensuring they received the exact same standard of care as the wounded rebels. Castro then released the surviving prisoners unharmed, instructing them to return to their commanding officers and deliver a first-hand account of the rebels' tactical capability and strict adherence to the laws of war. This calculated act of battlefield clemency operated as an effective psychological weapon, undermining the morale of the Cuban armed forces by proving that surrendering to the rebels was safer than fighting them. The victory at La Plata formally established the tactical blueprint of the rebel insurgency, dictating a strategy of launching rapid, overwhelming strikes against isolated targets, seizing the weaponry, and vanishing back into the protective canopy before reinforcements could arrive. However, the transition from hunted fugitives to an organized guerrilla force exposed the movement to the insidious, ever-present threat of internal betrayal, necessitating the creation of a ruthless counter-intelligence apparatus. In early February 1957, a local peasant named Eutimio Guerra who had initially served as a trusted guide for the rebels, faced a sudden, overwhelming financial temptation orchestrated by the Batista regime. The military command in Santiago, frustrated by their inability to locate the rebel camp through conventional reconnaissance, quietly offered Guerra a staggering bounty of 10,000 pesos and a senior military rank in exchange for Castro's exact coordinates. Guerra, seduced by a sum of cash that a rural farmer could not legitimately earn in 10 lifetimes, accepted the bribe and returned to the rebel encampment under the guise of delivering fresh civilian supplies. He carefully memorized the specific topography of their hidden camp at the Altos de Espinosa, noting the precise location of Castro's command tent, and secretly traveled back down the mountain to deliver the actionable intelligence to the waiting military commanders. Acting upon Guerra's precise coordinates, the Cuban Air Force launched a massive targeted bombing run on February 9th, dropping incendiary explosives directly onto the exact grid square where the rebels had been sleeping. The decapitation strike only failed because Castro, possessing an instinctual paranoia and insistence on constant mobility, had ordered the camp to be moved several hundred yards up the ridge just hours before the bombers arrived. The proximity of the strike immediately alerted the rebel leadership that an informant had penetrated their inner circle, launching a tense, systematic internal investigation to identify the source of the leak. When Guerra mysteriously reappeared at the new camp several days later, claiming he had barely escaped a military patrol in the valley, rebel scouts noticed a glaring, uncharacteristic detail regarding his personal equipment. He was carrying a newly issued .45 caliber military pistol, a specific sidearm strictly reserved for active duty Cuban army officers, and impossible for a rural peasant to acquire legally. A quiet, immediate search of his belongings uncovered a formal, signed safe conduct pass issued directly by Colonel Casillas Lumpui, a senior Batista commander, guaranteeing Guerra safe passage through any military checkpoint on the island. Confronted with this undeniable physical evidence, Guerra confessed to the betrayal, admitting that he had directed the bombers and had intended to assassinate Castro personally if the airstrike failed to neutralize the leadership. The situation presented a stark, unforgiving test of the rebels' internal discipline and their willingness to execute the harsh justice required to maintain operational security in a hostile environment. A swift, formal military tribunal was convened beneath the jungle canopy, where the evidence was presented. The confession was entered into the formal record, and Guerra was sentenced to death for high treason against the movement. To spare the younger, less experienced rebels the psychological burden of executing a man they had once considered a friend, Che Guevara stepped forward and administered the execution with a single pistol shot, treating the act as a clinical, necessary function of revolutionary warfare. The execution was carried out quickly and quietly, establishing a cold, pragmatic boundary that demonstrated to both the rebels and the surrounding peasantry that betrayal would be met with swift, uncompromising lethal force. This rigorous enforcement of internal security purged the camp of vulnerable elements, permanently cementing a culture of ideological loyalty and strict military discipline within the vanguard of the rebel army. Through these initial weeks of tactical experimentation, economic diplomacy with the peasants, and rigid counterintelligence, the core leadership had successfully forged the foundational architecture of a shadow state operating outside of Batista's control. They had proven that a small, mobile, ideologically unified guerrilla force could survive in the mountains, defeat regular army patrols, and extract vital resources from the surrounding civilian population without resorting to terror or theft. The geopolitical implications of this shadow state were profound. As the rebels began to quietly unravel the fabric of the Batista regime, not through massive conventional battles, but through the slow, systematic erosion of the state's monopoly on legitimate violence, Every single time, a peasant chose to bring their grievances to the rebel commanders instead of the local rural guard. The legal and moral authority of the Cuban government deteriorated further. Batista's generals, receiving the reports from the released prisoners of La Plata and analyzing the failure of the Altos de Espinosa bombing, realized they were no longer dealing with a disorganized band of stranded civilians. They recognized an evolving, adaptive insurgency taking root in the most inaccessible region of the country, led by men who understood how to transform the punishing geography of the Sierra Maestra into a tactical multiplier. To combat this growing threat, the regime intensified its blanket censorship of the national press, forbidding any Cuban newspaper or radio station from mentioning Fidel Castro, the Sierra Maestra, or the existence of an armed rebellion. Batista understood that the primary battlefield was not the physical jungle, but the psychological perception of the Cuban public, operating under the logical assumption that if the citizens remained ignorant of the rebellion, they would not rise to support it. Castro, aware of this suffocating media blackout, recognized that winning the military skirmishes in the mountains was strategically useless. If the broader Cuban population and the international diplomatic community believed he was dead, he needed a mechanism to bypass the national censorship apparatus and project the reality of his survival directly into the living rooms of the political elites in Havana and the policymakers in Washington. He required an objective, internationally respected voice capable of breaking the silence imposed by the dictatorship, setting the stage for one of the most audacious public relations maneuvers in modern military history. The groundwork for the guerrilla war was formally complete. The roots of the revolution had securely anchored themselves in the fertile, blood-stained soil of the Sierra Maestra, and the isolated rebel commander was preparing to introduce himself to the world. When an authoritarian regime successfully establishes a total monopoly over the domestic press, objective truth becomes a dangerous, tightly quarantined contraband that must be smuggled across borders to survive. By February 1957, Fulgencio Batista had meticulously constructed a massive, efficient censorship apparatus, explicitly forbidding any Cuban newspaper or radio station from broadcasting the name Fidel Castro. The dictator's military spokesman had confidently, repeatedly assured the national public and the international diplomatic community that the Granma expedition was a total failure and its commander was definitively dead. This coordinated campaign of state-sponsored silence presented a massive existential strategic threat to the isolated, outnumbered rebels surviving in the deep canopy of the Sierra Maestra. Castro understood a fundamental, rigorously proven law of modern asymmetric warfare, recognizing that a guerrilla insurgency cannot secure vital funding, urban recruits, or political legitimacy if the population believes it has already been exterminated. He realized that attempting to bypass Batista's censorship through clandestine, underground Cuban pamphlets would be inadequate, as the regime would simply dismiss them as desperate fabrications printed by exiled dissidents. To shatter the military's narrative and irreversibly humiliate the dictatorship on the global stage, Castro required a massive, internationally respected platform immune to Batista's domestic legal authority. He specifically targeted the American press, correctly analyzing that the United States government and the wealthy American corporate investors were the ultimate, indispensable pillars actively holding up the Batista regime. If Castro could successfully manipulate American public opinion, he could directly threaten the massive flow of United States military aid and political endorsement that Batista required to maintain his grip on the island. To execute this audacious logistical maneuver, Castro secretly dispatched Faustino P. Flores, a trusted, capable urban coordinator, out of the mountain encampment and directly into the guarded streets of Havana. P. Flores bypassed multiple military checkpoints, quietly arriving in the capital with a specific, dangerous mission to secure a trusted foreign correspondent willing to risk their life to interview a supposedly dead man. He discreetly contacted the Havana bureau of the New York Times, carefully offering them the exclusive, coveted opportunity to conduct a first-hand, face-to-face interview with the legendary rebel commander. The editors in New York selected Herbert Matthews, a 64-year-old, distinguished veteran war correspondent who possessed documented sympathy for underdog resistance movements. Having previously covered the Spanish Civil War, Matthews represented the exact specific psychological profile that Castro required. An idealistic, romantic journalist who was ideologically predisposed to view the rebels not as dangerous radicals, but as noble democratic freedom fighters. The logistical execution of smuggling a prominent, recognizable American journalist out of policed Havana and directly into a remote rebel mountain encampment required a brilliant, meticulously orchestrated campaign of civilian deception. Matthews and his wife formally registered at a prominent, visible luxury hotel in the capital, deliberately establishing a mundane, public itinerary to misdirect the watchful agents of the Cuban secret police. Leaving his wife behind as an effective decoy, Matthews quietly slipped out of the hotel, wearing a simple linen gayabera to blend in with local wealthy planters, and entered a waiting vehicle driven by underground operatives. The perilous, tense journey across the island required the team to successfully navigate a dense armed gauntlet of military roadblocks stationed along the central highway, relying on forged documents and quiet bribes. When they finally reached the deep forested foothills of the Sierra Maestra, Matthews was handed over to a network of trusted peasant guides, abandoning the vehicle and beginning a grueling, demanding physical ascent. The elderly journalist spent hours hiking through the steep, muddy, razor-sharp brush of the jungle under the cover of darkness, exhausted but driven by the profound journalistic gravity of the moment. In the early misty hours of February 17th, Matthews finally arrived at a small concealed rebel clearing, finding himself standing face to face with a towering, bearded Fidel Castro gripping a sniper rifle and smoking a cigar. What followed over the next several hours was not a standard journalistic interview, but a calculated, masterful piece of tactical political theater orchestrated by the rebel commander. Castro possessed exactly 18 ragged, severely malnourished, exhausted men at the time of the interview, an inadequate force that would have disappointed the American journalist and validated Batista's claims of insignificance. To mask this severe logistical weakness, Castro initiated a specific, authentic minor plot of deliberate military deception, utilizing the dense, obscuring jungle canopy as a theatrical stage. Before Matthews had arrived, Castro had quietly ordered his brother Raul to organize the men into small, mobile groups, instructing them to continuously march through the perimeter of the clearing in a wide, circular pattern. As Castro sat on a fallen log politely speaking with Matthews in hushed, confident tones, Raul would periodically dramatically emerge from the brush, loudly saluting and delivering fabricated situation reports. Raul would formally announce that the active second column had successfully secured the northern ridge, or that the armed third column was awaiting further orders, referencing massive military units that simply did not exist. The rebels would quickly swap their few pieces of captured military hardware, passing the single Browning automatic rifle or the Thompson submachine gun between different men to create the visual illusion of an armed, well-supplied battalion. Matthews, observing this continuous organized movement through the dense foliage, accepted the deliberate visual manipulation, incorrectly concluding that Castro commanded a massive disciplined army of at least 400 combat-ready troops. Beyond the brilliant logistical deception, Castro executed a rigorous, disciplined ideological manipulation, carefully tailoring his political rhetoric to precisely align with the held democratic values of the American public. He explicitly, forcefully presented himself not as a radical Marxist intent on violently dismantling the capitalist system, but as a moderate, constitutional Democrat fighting solely to restore the legal republic and hold free elections. He spoke passionately about implementing fair agrarian reforms and ending the brutal military corruption, deliberately omitting any specific economic policies that might alarm the wealthy American corporate investors observing the conflict. He understood that the United States government was locked in a massive, paranoid Cold War against global communism, and any hint of socialist ideology would instantly invite a devastating intervention by the Central Intelligence Agency. Matthews eagerly documented every single word, captivated by the rugged, romanticized image of the educated, articulate lawyer sacrificing his comfortable life to fight a corrupt, armed dictator in the jungle, to secure the undeniable physical proof required to shatter Batista's censorship apparatus. Castro allowed Matthews to capture a series of stark, intimate photographs of the rebel leader holding his scoped rifle. As an added layer of rigorous authentication, Castro personally signed his name and the exact date across the margin of one of the photographs, ensuring that the regime could not dismiss the images as old, recycled archive pictures. Following the successful theatrical interview, Matthews was quietly smuggled back down the mountain, retracing his steps through the heavy military checkpoints and successfully boarding a commercial flight back to New York. On the morning of February 24, 1957, the New York Times published the massive explosive interview on its front page, sending a devastating, uncontainable shockwave across the entire global diplomatic community. The detailed, sensational article explicitly confirmed that Fidel Castro was not only alive, but successfully commanding a massive, disciplined army that the Cuban military was powerless to locate or destroy. The psychological impact of this publication on the Batista dictatorship was immediate, profoundly humiliating and destructive to the tightly controlled, carefully maintained illusion of military supremacy. Batista's generals, sitting in their air-conditioned offices in Havana, were forced to read about the survival of their most dangerous enemy in the pages of an American newspaper that had been smuggled past their own customs agents. In a panicked, uncoordinated attempt at damage control, Batista's Minister of Defense held a hasty press conference, publicly declaring that the entire New York Times article was a fabrication and the photographs were doctored. He explicitly, arrogantly claimed that Matthews had never actually breached the military cordon around the Sierra Maestra, and that the man in the photograph was merely a hired actor wearing a fake beard. This specific, foolish official denial provided Matthews and the New York Times with the exact anticipated opportunity to execute a devastating, unanswerable journalistic counterstrike. The very next day, the newspaper aggressively published the original, uncropped photograph of Fidel Castro standing shoulder to shoulder with Herbert Matthews in the jungle, clearly displaying Castro's authenticated signature and the date. This undeniable physical proof shattered the credibility of the Cuban Minister of Defense, transforming the military regime into an object of massive public international ridicule. The political fallout from the Matthews interview altered the monitored geopolitical dynamic between the Batista dictatorship and the United States State Department, shifting the momentum in favor of the rebels. American politicians and influential diplomats, moved by the romanticized portrayal of the democratic freedom fighters, began to quietly, seriously question the strategic wisdom of continuing to arm an unpopular, corrupt military dictator. The article successfully generated a massive, lucrative wave of sympathetic financial support from the wealthy Cuban exile community in the United States, who eagerly sent thousands of dollars to fund the suddenly viable revolution. More importantly, the publication revitalized the fractured, demoralized urban resistance movement back in Havana and Santiago, proving to the underground operatives that their supreme leader was actively fighting. Hundreds of frustrated, motivated university students and young urban professionals, reading the translated transcripts of the interview, began quietly making the dangerous, monitored journey toward the Oriente province to join the insurgency. Castro had brilliantly, seamlessly transformed a severe, nearly fatal military isolation into the greatest public relations victory of the entire decade, weaponizing the global media to accomplish what his tiny, inadequate arsenal could not. He had manufactured a powerful, unassailable myth of an invincible, ubiquitous rebel army, projecting a massive shadow across the island that terrified the Cuban military establishment. The soldiers in Batista's army, previously confident in their numerical superiority, began to fear the unmapped, forested mountains, believing they were facing a massive, equipped battalion rather than a starving handful of men. This profound psychological victory validated Castro's core belief that in the complex, interconnected theater of modern asymmetric warfare, the narrative perception of power is frequently more lethal than the actual physical reality of power. Having successfully secured his political legitimacy and shattered the national censorship apparatus, Castro could now pivot his organized intellect toward the actual, physical governance of his expanding mountain territory. He recognized that to eventually capture the capital, he could not simply remain a romanticized fugitive hiding in the brush. He had to systematically, relentlessly begin building the functional infrastructure of a new revolutionary state. The impenetrable jungle canopy was no longer merely a temporary hiding place for defeated exiles, but a secure, active staging ground for the unyielding conquest of the Cuban Republic. To survive the inevitable, destructive military counteroffensives that Batista was furiously preparing, the rebels needed to permanently anchor their revolution into the fertile soil of the rural peasantry, transforming the mountains into an impenetrable fortress of civilian loyalty. The theatrical illusion of power broadcast to the world now had to be rapidly, systematically converted into the hard logistical reality of a functioning armed guerrilla ecosystem, fundamentally changing the relationship between the rebels and the people they sought to govern. When a guerrilla vanguard successfully secures a permanent, physical sanctuary within the borders of a hostile state, the fundamental nature of the conflict immediately shifts from a desperate military evasion into a complex, logistical competition for civilian governance. Fidel Castro explicitly recognized that the massive, theatrical public relations victory achieved through the New York Times interview would become tactically useless if his men slowly starved to death in the dense, unforgiving canopy of the Sierra Maestra. He understood, relying on cold, rigorous strategic logic, that a rebel army isolated from external supply lines cannot possibly survive a prolonged war of attrition without fully integrating itself into the local socio-economic ecosystem. For generations, the Guajiros had existed in a state of crushing indentured servitude, working small plots of rugged, unyielding land that were legally owned by wealthy, absentee landlords residing in the luxurious suburbs of Havana. These peasants were routinely, systematically brutalized by the rural guard, Batista's corrupt, armed paramilitary police force, which essentially functioned as a private enforcement mechanism designed to collect exorbitant rents and evict indebted farmers. Batista's military commanders, operating under the flawed conventional doctrine of collective punishment, initiated a ruthless counterinsurgency campaign explicitly designed to sever the physical connection between the rural population and the rebel army. Whenever a military patrol encountered a rebel ambush, the Cuban Air Force would indiscriminately drop heavy incendiary bombs on the nearest peasant village, operating under the brutal, lazy assumption that any civilian living in the mountains was an active rebel sympathizer. This strategy of untargeted state violence produced a predictable, catastrophic logistical backfire for the Batista regime, forcing neutral, terrified peasants to realize that simply remaining uninvolved offered no protection against military airstrikes. Faced with the undeniable reality that the government forces would execute them regardless of their actual political affiliation, the Guajiros systematically began migrating their families deeper into the high-altitude rebel zones to seek physical protection. Castro capitalized on this massive influx of displaced civilians by establishing a rigid, uncompromising code of revolutionary justice, explicitly designed to demonstrate that his shadow state possessed a higher moral authority than the corrupt national government. He understood that the rural population had never experienced a legal system that actually protected their property, leading him to enforce a strict mandate that any rebel soldier caught stealing even a single chicken from a farmer would face an immediate military tribunal. This commitment to rural justice was successfully tested during a specific authentic minor plot involving the capture of Chicho Osorio, a feared, sadistic local foreman who actively worked as a paid informant for Batista's military. Osorio had spent months terrorizing the local peasantry, utilizing his connections with the rural guard to expropriate land, steal livestock, and quietly murder rural farmers who dared to dispute his illegal evictions. Rebel scouts managed to capture Osorio while he was intoxicated and wandering near a guarded perimeter, bringing him directly into the rebel encampment where he mistakenly assumed he was speaking to a rival band of Batista's soldiers. Operating under this fatal misconception, Osorio proudly boasted about his extensive history of executing rebel sympathizers, explicitly detailing the exact methods he used to terrorize the local Guajiros on behalf of the dictatorship. Castro utilized this uncoerced, detailed confession to convene a formal, public tribunal attended by dozens of local peasants, utilizing the trial to meticulously document Osorio's extensive crimes against the rural community. Following a swift, legally rigorous presentation of the evidence, Osorio was sentenced to death and immediately executed by a rebel firing squad, an act that sent a profound, visible shockwave of relief throughout the entire mountain range. The local farmers watched the execution of their greatest tormentor and reached a cold, rational socio-economic conclusion, realizing that the rebel army was the first institution in Cuban history to actually enforce the rule of law on their behalf. To permanently cement this unyielding civilian loyalty, Castro moved beyond mere physical protection and initiated a massive, structural economic revolution, drafting and executing the specific administrative decrees of the Sierra Maestra agrarian reform. He systematically abolished all tenant farming rents within the liberated territories, explicitly decreeing that any peasant who actively worked a plot of land less than 67 hectares now held the unquestionable legal deed to that property. This brilliant, pragmatic legislative maneuver aligned the financial survival of the peasantry with the military survival of the rebel army, creating an unbreakable, motivated civilian logistics network. The Guajiros understood with clarity that their newly acquired land deeds were guaranteed only by the rifles of Castro's soldiers, and that if Batista's military ever reconquered the mountains, the wealthy landlords would immediately return to reclaim the soil. Therefore, defending the rebel encampments was no longer an abstract ideological exercise in national democracy, but a personal urgent defense of their own homes, their own crops, and their own economic independence. While Castro secured the political and legal architecture of this newly formed shadow state, Ernesto Che Guevara was quietly, methodically engineering the physical, logistical infrastructure required to sustain a permanent mountain civilization. Guevara recognized that relying on clandestine lowland supply chains for basic human necessities created a massive, vulnerable tactical liability, as civilian couriers were constantly intercepted, tortured, and executed by Batista's highway checkpoints. To sever this logistical dependency, Guevara established a permanent, fortified operational base within a rugged, inaccessible valley known as El Hombrito, transforming a temporary bivouac into a functioning industrial settlement. He specifically commanded the construction of a massive clay brick bread oven, explicitly designed to output hundreds of fresh rations daily, eliminating the rebel army's reliance on compromised urban bakeries. Understanding that the grueling, razor-sharp terrain of the jungle was rapidly destroying the rebels' canvas footwear, Guevara actively recruited local cobblers to construct a small, efficient shoe factory right in the middle of the jungle. He utilized local tobacco leaves to establish a functional cigar factory, recognizing that providing the stressed, exhausted combatants with a steady supply of tobacco served as a critical, effective tool for maintaining troop morale. Most importantly, Guevara leveraged his formal medical training to construct a dedicated, organized field hospital at El Hombrito, stocking it with surgical instruments, antibiotics, and surgical sterilized bandages smuggled up the mountain by sympathetic urban doctors. This hospital did not merely treat wounded combatants, but deliberately opened its doors to the surrounding civilian population, providing pediatric care, dental extractions, and basic hygienic education to families who suffered from chronic parasites and malnutrition. By establishing these permanent industrial and medical facilities, the rebels explicitly demonstrated to the rural population that they were not temporary, armed bandits, but the organized, competent administrators of a legitimate alternative government. Complementing this massive physical infrastructure was a profound, strategic campaign of intellectual empowerment. As the rebel leadership recognized that political loyalty required a populace capable of reading and understanding the revolutionary manifestos, the vast majority of the adult Guajiros were illiterate, unable to read basic agricultural contracts, state newspapers, or the publicized legal decrees that historically governed their indentured lives. Castro and Guevara mandated that every rebel encampment establish a functional evening school, utilizing educated university students from Havana to teach weathered, elderly farmers how to read and write by the flickering light of the campfires. They utilized captured, stamped Batista military training manuals, outdated agricultural magazines, and classic works of Spanish literature as improvised textbooks, slowly, methodically pulling the rural population out of historically enforced intellectual darkness. When a peasant farmer successfully learned to write his own name for the very first time, eliminating his reliance on corrupt landlords to interpret legal documents, his psychological devotion to the rebel cause became permanent, unshakable. However, the successful consolidation of this mountain ecosystem presented Castro with a new, pressing strategic dilemma regarding how to successfully project this rural authority back into the censored, densely populated urban centers of the island. He realized that while the New York Times interview had successfully established his international legitimacy, he could not permanently rely on foreign journalists to dictate the daily, volatile narrative of the Cuban Revolution to his own citizens. To bypass Batista's suffocating national media blackout, Castro authorized a specific, ambitious logistical operation to secretly transport a functioning radio transmitter directly into the high-altitude peaks of the Sierra Maestra. In February 1958, a trusted urban operative named Carlos Franqui managed to quietly purchase a heavy, sensitive Collins radio transmitter, dismantling the complex electronic components to hide them inside standard civilian luggage. Franqui and a team of burdened mules systematically navigated the steep, guarded mountain passes, carefully carrying the fragile vacuum tubes, the heavy copper wiring, and a massive gasoline-powered generator directly into Guevara's command post. The rebels painstakingly assembled the broadcasting equipment inside a small, concealed wooden hut, stringing massive copper antenna wires between the highest branches of the towering jungle canopy to maximize the transmission range. On February 24th, after weeks of frustrating technical failures and agonizing static, the rebel technicians finally achieved a clear, stable transmission frequency that penetrated through the dense mountain atmosphere. The broadcast began with a simple, electrifying declaration that immediately shattered the silence of Batista's censorship apparatus. As a calm, resonant voice stated, "Aquí Radio Rebelda, transmitiendo desde la Sierra Maestra." Radio Rebelda rapidly transformed into the most powerful, lethal psychological weapon in the rebel arsenal, broadcasting detailed battle reports, political manifestos, and specific instructions for urban sabotage directly into the living rooms of Havana. Batista's military intelligence fiercely, desperately attempted to jam the rebel frequencies, deploying sophisticated electronic countermeasures. But the rebels simply altered their broadcast schedules and constantly shifted their transmission wavelengths to evade the blocking signals. The Cuban public, exhausted by the fabricated, sanitized propaganda printed in the state-owned newspapers, began tuning their civilian radio dials to the rebel frequency every single night, eagerly consuming the unfiltered, accurate reality of the war. Castro utilized Radio Rebelda to methodically read the names of Batista's soldiers who had been captured, treated at the rebel hospital, and safely released, explicitly proving to the mothers of the military conscripts that the regime was lying about rebel atrocities. By directly engaging the urban population, identifying corrupt military officers by name, and dictating the specific terms of the future republic, the shadow state of the Sierra Maestra effectively expanded its psychological borders to encompass the entire island. The guerrilla ecosystem was now self-sustaining, generating its own food supply, manufacturing its own basic goods, operating its own medical facilities, and projecting its own unassailable media narrative across the guarded airspace of the dictatorship. Fulgencio Batista, sitting in the air-conditioned, paranoid chambers of the presidential palace, reviewed the frantic intelligence reports detailing the massive industrial and administrative consolidation occurring within the mountains. The dictator realized, utilizing cold, objective military logic, that his reliance on small, isolated rural guard patrols and arbitrary, inaccurate aerial bombardments had failed to dislodge the insurgency. He understood that the rebel army was no longer a scattered, starving remnant of exiles, but an entrenched, disciplined military force backed by an impenetrable, loyal civilian logistical network. To prevent this functional shadow government from amputating the entire eastern half of the Cuban Republic, Batista recognized that he had to immediately deploy the full, mechanized weight of his conventional armed forces. The polite, frustrating era of minor skirmishes and psychological maneuvering was rapidly concluding, as the Cuban High Command began drafting the complex, classified logistical blueprints for a massive, overwhelming military sweep. Batista prepared to unleash his heavy armored divisions, his artillery battalions, and thousands of trained combat troops, intending to march directly into the high altitudes and permanently eradicate the rebel ecosystem. The fortified, integrated mountain sanctuary that Castro and Guevara had meticulously built was about to face the ultimate, destructive test of its physical resilience against the heaviest concentration of military firepower ever assembled in Cuban history. The quiet rhythm of the guerrilla camps, characterized by literacy classes and agricultural reform, was slowly, inevitably being replaced by the tense, meticulous preparation for a brutal conventional war of annihilation. When an irregular guerrilla force successfully builds a functioning shadow state within a hostile territory, the leadership often succumbs to the dangerous, premature assumption that the national government is teetering on the edge of immediate collapse. By the spring of 1958, Fidel Castro and the rebel command firmly believed that the urban centers of Cuba were fully prepared to rise up and violently dismantle the Batista dictatorship without the need for a prolonged conventional military campaign. Relying on this optimistic political calculus, Castro formally authorized the urban underground of the 26th of July movement to organize a massive, nationwide general strike scheduled precisely for April 9th. The strategic logic behind this strike was rigorously sound on paper, explicitly designed to paralyze the Cuban economy by halting all industrial production, shutting down public transportation, and severing the logistical arteries of Havana. Castro assumed that this civilian paralysis would force Batista's military into a state of chaotic overextension, providing the urban militias with the exact tactical window required to seize critical radio stations, armories, and police headquarters. However, the logistical execution of this ambitious urban operation suffered from a catastrophic, fatal breakdown in communication between the isolated mounting command and the vulnerable underground operatives operating in the capital. The rebel organizers deliberately withheld the specific date of the strike from the participating labor unions until the last possible moment, desperately attempting to maintain operational security and prevent Batista's secret police from discovering the timeline. This intense paranoia proved to be a severe tactical liability, as thousands of sympathetic factory workers and bus drivers simply failed to receive the clandestine strike orders in time to safely abandon their posts. Compounding this massive logistical failure, the urban militias deployed into the streets of Havana were severely underarmed, equipped with little more than outdated revolvers and improvised explosives to confront a mechanized, prepared state police force. Batista's chief of police in Havana, a ruthlessly efficient, decorated commander named Pilar Garcek, had actively anticipated the urban uprising and immediately deployed armed patrol units with uncompromising shoot-to-kill orders. The April 9th strike violently disintegrated within a matter of hours, as the Cuban police easily isolated the small, fragmented pockets of rebel resistance and systematically eradicated them in the streets. Dozens of young, dedicated urban operatives were gunned down, captured, or summarily executed in the dark alleys of the capital, dealing a devastating, demoralizing blow to the entire national resistance movement. Fulgencio Batista observed the collapse of the general strike and reached a cold, pragmatic military conclusion. Recognizing that the rebel underground had just exhausted its urban capabilities and severely exposed its logistical vulnerability, the dictator understood that Castro was currently isolated in the mountains without the protective shield of a coordinated urban threat, presenting the Cuban armed forces with an unprecedented, specific window of opportunity to permanently annihilate the insurgency. Batista's senior generals immediately drafted the strategic blueprints for a massive, aggressive summer counteroffensive, officially designated as Operation Verano, but quietly, confidently referred to by the High Command as the Fin de Fidel. The sheer, undeniable logistical scale of Operation Verano explicitly demonstrated the massive, armed disparity between the recognized nation-state and the isolated rebel ecosystem. The Cuban military systematically mobilized over 12,000 combat troops, fully supported by heavy artillery battalions, armored mechanized units, and unrestricted, concentrated aerial bombardment from the Cuban Air Force. To confront this massive, organized invasion force, Fidel Castro possessed a maximum of 300 lightly armed combatants. Lacking anti-aircraft weaponry, heavy artillery, or dedicated armored support, Batista's field commander, General Eulogio Cantillo, designed a conventional traditional pincer movement, intending to deploy massive infantry columns from the north, while simultaneously launching an amphibious naval landing on the southern coast to encircle the mountains. General Cantillo operated under the strict, flawed military doctrine that armed, numerically superior conventional forces would inevitably crush a lightly armed irregular unit once they were successfully forced into a static engagement. Castro, recognizing the tactical absurdity of engaging a 12,000-man army in a conventional defensive line, immediately ordered his forces to abandon the fortified periphery of their liberated territory. He utilized the imposing razor-sharp topography of the Sierra Maestra as his primary defensive weapon, deliberately ordering his men to retreat into the most hostile, vertically unyielding ravines of the mountain range. This strategic withdrawal forced Batista's heavy infantry battalions to abandon the flat, accessible coastal plains and march directly into a suffocating, unmapped jungle environment that neutralized their technological superiority. The heavy Sherman tanks and armored personnel carriers that Batista's military relied upon for tactical dominance were physically useless in the dense, forested mountain passes, stripping the infantry of their mechanized protection. As the conventional troops advanced deeper into the oppressive tropical heat, they were forced to stretch their fragile, vulnerable supply lines across miles of steep, entrenched mountain trails. Castro systematically divided his 300 men into small, mobile sniper teams, explicitly ordering them to avoid sustained firefights and focus on utilizing the dense jungle canopy to execute rapid, lethal hit-and-run ambushes. The rebels heavily mined the narrow dirt paths with improvised explosives packed into hollowed-out tin cans, deliberately targeting the lead vehicles and the vanguard scouts of the advancing military columns to force a logistical halt. When an improvised mine detonated, the rebel snipers would open fire from elevated, invisible positions in the tree line, targeting the military officers and the radio operators before instantly melting back into the impenetrable brush. These relentless, localized ambushes inflicted minimal actual casualties, but generated a massive, devastating psychological toll on Batista's soldiers, the vast majority of whom were poorly trained, reluctant teenage conscripts. The conscripts found themselves marching blindly through a suffocating, malarial jungle, unable to see the enemy firing upon them, exhausted by the terrain, and terrified of stepping on hidden explosives. The psychological erosion of the Cuban army culminated in a specific, authentic historical engagement known as the Battle of Exiled, which occurred during the sweltering peak of the summer offensive in July. General Cantillo had ordered an aggressive, armed infantry battalion, designated as Battalion 18, to push into rebel territory to establish an advanced operational staging ground near the San Lorenzo River. The commanding officer of this battalion was Major José Quevedo, an intelligent, experienced professional soldier who possessed a specific, intimately personal historical connection to Fidel Castro. Having been his university classmate in Havana, Major Quevedo successfully marched his armed troops directly into the small, forested clearing of Exiled, unaware that he had just walked into a meticulously designed, lethal, tactical trap. Castro had explicitly allowed Battalion 18 to advance into the ravine without facing significant resistance, deliberately waiting until the soldiers established their camp before sealing off the only viable exit routes with heavy machine gun fire. Instead of ordering a costly, suicidal frontal assault against the entrenched military position, Castro deployed a cold, rigorous strategy of logistical starvation. cutting off the battalion's access to fresh water and intercepting their supply reinforcements. For over a week, Major Quevedo and his men were trapped in the sweltering, exposed clearing, forced to endure constant sniper fire while their ammunition dwindled. Their wounded soldiers suffered, and their food supplies evaporated. Batista's air force attempted to relieve the besieged battalion by airdropping heavy crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and canned food into the clearing. But the rebel positions were so tightly coiled around the camp that the vast majority of the parachutes drifted directly into Castro's hands. Recognizing that the conventional military situation was untenable, Castro initiated a brilliant psychological diplomatic maneuver, bypassing the traditional military chain of command to directly address his former university peer. Castro explicitly ordered his men to cease firing and dispatched a quiet, respectful handwritten letter directly across the battle lines to Major Quevedo, addressing him by his first name and acknowledging their shared academic history. In the letter, Castro meticulously detailed the logistical reality of the battalion's surrounded position, politely highlighting the sheer futility of further bloodshed and offering generous, honorable terms of surrender. He explicitly guaranteed the physical safety of every single soldier, promising that the wounded would be immediately treated by Che Guevara's medical staff and that the prisoners would be promptly returned to the Cuban military through the International Red Cross. Major Quevedo, exhausted by the siege, disillusioned by the failure of his commanding generals to send adequate reinforcements, and moved by the civilized, respectful tone of the rebel commander, made an irrevocable historical decision. On July 21, 1958, Major Quevedo formally surrendered the entirety of Battalion 18, handing over massive quantities of essential military hardware, including heavy mortars, light machine guns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition, directly to the rebel forces. The surrender at El Jig was an unmitigated tactical disaster for Batista's military, but Castro's subsequent handling of the captured soldiers transformed the military defeat into a lethal psychological catastrophe for the entire dictatorship. Castro rigorously honored his written promises, utilizing the rebel field hospitals to surgically treat the wounded military conscripts and allowing the defeated soldiers to retain their personal dignity before formally handing them over to Red Cross officials. The rebel leader immediately utilized the powerful, reaching frequencies of Radio Rebelda to broadcast the specific detailed terms of the surrender, explicitly reading the names of the treated soldiers to prove to their families in Havana that they were alive and well. When the captured, fully treated soldiers eventually returned to their conventional military bases in the lowlands, they brought back subversive, authentic first-hand accounts of the rebels' strict military discipline and their profound, undeniable humanity. This targeted psychological warfare shattered the propagandized narrative pushed by Batista's generals, who had spent months terrifying their conscripts with fabricated stories of horrific rebel torture and executions. The realization that surrendering to Fidel Castro was actually significantly safer and far more honorable than fighting a futile war in the jungle rapidly infected the entire command structure of the Cuban arm. Forces, like a terminal virus. Throughout the remainder of July and into August, Operation Verano rapidly, violently disintegrated, as entire Cuban infantry companies actively refused orders to march into the mountains, explicitly citing the failure of their senior leadership. General Cantillo's armored offensive had stalled undeniably, resulting in the loss of hundreds of professional soldiers, the surrender of massive quantities of heavy weaponry, and the destruction of his army's combat morale. In early August, recognizing the catastrophic logistical reality of the situation, the Cuban High Command quietly, humiliatingly issued the formal orders for a total, systemic withdrawal of all military forces from the Sierra Maestra, Operation Verano failed spectacularly to annihilate the 300 rebels, inadvertently functioning as an efficient weapons supply chain that rearmed and modernized Castro's guerrilla forces. Fulgencio Batista had played his final military card, deploying the entire conventional weight of his armed forces, and he had been decisively, rigorously defeated by the physical terrain and the psychological mastery of the rebel command. The suffocating silence that settled over the mountains as the final military convoys retreated back to the coastal plains did not signify the end of the conflict, but rather the volatile, inevitable transition of operational momentum. Fidel Castro, possessing a newly expanded, armed, battle-hardened military force, realized that the fortified, entrenched defensive phase of the Cuban Revolution was permanently concluded. The dictator's massive offensive had inadvertently stripped the coastal lowlands of their most capable combat units, creating a profound, exposed tactical void stretching across the central provinces of the island. The isolated mountain ecosystem that had meticulously shielded the rebellion for nearly 2 years was now preparing to violently, aggressively export its revolution directly into the vulnerable, populated economic heartland of the Republic. When a besieged military force successfully repels a state-sponsored offensive of annihilation, the surviving commanders must immediately confront the strict, unforgiving calculus of operational momentum. By late August 1958, Fidel Castro analyzed the logistical collapse of Batista's Operation Verano and recognized that remaining strictly on the defensive within the Sierra Maestra would grant the dictatorship the necessary time to resupply and regroup. He understood, relying on rigorous historical precedents drawn from Cuba's 19th-century wars of independence, that the regime could only be permanently dismantled if the rebels physically carried the armed conflict out of the eastern mountains and directly into the economic heartland of the island. To execute this strategic breakout, Castro authorized the immediate deployment of 2 specialized, fast-moving guerrilla columns, explicitly ordering them to abandon the protective canopy of the Oriente province and march westward toward the central province of Las Villas. Column 2 was placed under the command of Camilo Cienfuegos, a former tailor from Havana whose affable civilian demeanor masked a relentless, tactically brilliant military mind. Column 8 was entrusted to Ernesto Che Guevara, who was tasked with navigating his forces across the Central Plains, capturing the vital provincial capital of Santa Clara, and physically severing the island's primary transportation arteries. The operational execution of this westward march required these 2 columns, comprising roughly 140 men each, to leave the secure, elevated terrain of the mountains and traverse over 300 miles of flat, exposed agricultural lowlands. This logistical undertaking immediately devolved into a brutal test of human endurance as the rebels marched directly into the flat, sprawling cattle ranches of the Camagüey province in early September. Their arrival coincided precisely with the destructive landfall of Hurricane Ella, a Category 4 storm that systematically flooded the vast coastal plains and transformed the central highway networks into impassable, waist-deep swamps. To evade Batista's aerial reconnaissance planes, which relentlessly patrolled the daylight skies searching for rebel movements, Guevara and Cienfuegos forced their men to march exclusively at night through the flooded, mosquito-infested marshes. The men waded through standing water for weeks at a time, unable to build fires for warmth or cook their meager rations without signaling their exact coordinates to the circling military bombers. When their standard supply of rice and beans evaporated, the columns were forced to butcher stray horses, eating the meat raw to avoid generating smoke, a dietary necessity that triggered severe, widespread outbreaks of dysentery. The constant immersion in the muddy, Contaminated floodwaters caused the rebels' leather boots to literally rot off their feet, forcing dozens of combatants to march barefoot across the sharp, abrasive limestone outcroppings of the Central Plains. Despite suffering from severe malnutrition, chronic trench foot, and relentless asthma attacks that forced him to occasionally ride tied to the saddle of a confiscated horse, Guevara maintained uncompromising discipline over Column 8. He strictly forbade his men from stealing dry clothing or food from the local rural farms they passed, insisting that the revolutionary vanguard must maintain its moral superiority even while actively starving to death. By mid-October, having successfully evaded several major military encirclements through sheer physical endurance, Guevara's column finally reached the elevated, protective terrain of the Escambray Mountains in the central province of Las Villas. However, arriving in the Escambray immediately presented Guevara with a complex, dangerous political crisis that required him to temporarily abandon his role as a field commander and operate as a ruthless, calculating diplomat. Unlike the Sierra Maestra, which was under the undisputed control of Castro's 26th of July movement, the Escambray Mountains were currently occupied by several competing fractured anti-Batista guerrilla organizations. The most prominent of these factions was the Directorio Revolucionario, a militant student organization from Havana led by Rolando Cubela, which possessed a formidable arsenal but fiercely maintained its own independent command structure. Another faction, the Second National Front of Escambray, was led by Eloy Gutierrez Manoyo, a commander who operated his militia less like a revolutionary army and more like a corrupt, localized warlord extracting taxes from the regional peasantry. Guevara understood that launching a successful assault on the fortified city of Santa Clara would be tactical suicide if the rebel forces operating in the surrounding mountains remained divided, suspicious, and prone to internal skirmishes. He initiated a series of tense, prolonged negotiations with the leadership of the Directorio Revolucionario, sitting around campfires and methodically debating the strict ideological parameters and logistical requirements of a unified command. Guevara utilized a combination of strict political logic and the undeniable military leverage provided by his battle-hardened troops to convince Cubela that capturing the central province required a synchronized, centralized military strategy. On December 1, 1958, these rigorous negotiations culminated in the formal signing of the Pact of the Pedrero, a binding political and military treaty that successfully subordinated the various guerrilla factions under Guevara's operational command. He simultaneously isolated the corrupt elements of the Second National Front, explicitly barring them from the unified coalition and threatening severe military retaliation if they interfered with the impending offensive. Having brilliantly resolved the internal political friction and consolidated his troop strength, Guevara turned his operational focus toward the city of Santa Clara, the logistical linchpin of the Cuban Republic. Santa Clara, the capital of Las Villas province, possessed a population of roughly 150,000 residents and contained the critical railway junctions and highway intersections that connected Havana to the eastern half of the island. If the rebel forces could capture this specific city, they would effectively sever Batista's physical ability to transport troops, weapons, and fuel to his remaining garrisons in the east, permanently splitting the nation in two. Fulgencio Batista recognized the existential threat posed by Guevara's advancing coalition and decided to deploy a massive, technologically advanced mobile fortress explicitly designed to crush the rebel offensive and secure the provincial capital. The dictator authorized the deployment of the Tren Blindado, an armored multi-car military train that essentially functioned as a rolling, steel-plated command center and mobile weapons depot. The train consisted of 2 diesel locomotives pulling several boxcars that had been heavily retrofitted at a state-owned shipyard with thick, impenetrable steel armor plating, providing the soldiers inside with protection from small arms fire. Batista packed this armored train with nearly 400 elite, combat-ready soldiers, equipping them with millions of dollars in modern munitions, including Swiss-made anti-aircraft guns, heavy mortars, bazookas, and thousands of rounds of machine gun ammunition. When the tren blindado rolled into the central station of Santa Clara in late December, it provided an immediate, tangible boost to the morale of the local military garrison, projecting an aura of overwhelming, unassailable conventional firepower. The military officers commanding the train recognized that Santa Clara was surrounded by flat, easily defensible terrain, and they confidently established their primary defensive position at the base of the Loma del Capiro, a small hill overlooking the city's railway approach. Guevara, commanding a combined force of roughly 300 lightly armed rebels, arrived on the outskirts of Santa Clara on December 28th, immediately initiating a systematic, block-by-block urban assault against the city's outer defensive perimeters. The rebels utilized civilian homes to bypass the heavily defended street intersections, utilizing sledgehammers and pickaxes to physically smash holes through the shared interior walls of the residential row houses. This tactic, known as mouse-holing, allowed the guerrilla fighters to advance rapidly toward the city center, without ever stepping foot onto the exposed pavement, neutralizing the lethal effectiveness of the military's rooftop snipers. As the urban combat intensified around the central plaza, Guevara directed his primary tactical attention toward the armored train parked at the Loma del Capiro, recognizing that its vast arsenal posed the single greatest threat to his operation. Rebel infantry units launched a series of probing attacks against the train, pouring rifle fire into the steel-plated boxcars. But the small-caliber bullets simply bounced off the heavy armor, failing to inflict any structural damage or casualties. The military commanders inside the train, possessing overwhelming suppressive firepower and secure behind their steel walls, initially viewed the rebel attacks as a minor, easily manageable nuisance. However, when rebel forces managed to secure the elevated heights of the Loma del Capiro, raining steady rifle fire down onto the roof of the train, the military officers made a fateful, strictly defensive tactical decision, seeking better sightlines and a more secure defensive posture. The commanding officers ordered the locomotives to reverse away from the hill, intending to slowly reposition the entire armored train closer to the center of the city. Guevara, observing this specific movement, recognized that attacking the fortified train with conventional firearms was futile, requiring an unconventional, physical logistical solution to permanently immobilize the rolling fortress. He immediately dispatched a small, specialized unit of rebels to the nearby agricultural department of the local university, instructing them to requisition a specific piece of heavy civilian machinery capable of altering the battlefield geography. The rebels commandeered a bright yellow heavy-duty Caterpillar D6 bulldozer from the agricultural campus, hot-wiring the engine and driving the massive, steel, tracked vehicle directly toward the railway lines just outside the city station. Operating under heavy, continuous covering fire from the surrounding buildings, the rebel engineers drove the bulldozer onto the tracks, lowered the heavy steel blade, and wedged it firmly beneath the wooden railway ties. With a grinding, metallic roar, the bulldozer violently ripped up over 30 feet of the primary steel railway tracks, twisting the rails and destroying the fundamental structural integrity of the line. When the reversing locomotives of the tren blindado reached this specific compromised section of the track, the massive weight of the armored boxcars immediately triggered a catastrophic, unavoidable derailment. The heavy steel train cars violently jumped the broken tracks, slamming into one another with deafening force and tumbling awkwardly onto their sides in the dirt, locking the doors and trapping the soldiers inside a chaotic, immobile steel labyrinth. The sudden, violent transition from a mobile, armed fortress into a derailed, static prison shattered the operational confidence and the tactical cohesion of the elite military unit trapped inside. Recognizing that the train's steel armor was now functioning as a trap rather than a shield, Guevara immediately ordered his men to abandon their rifles and transition to a crude, effective incendiary weapon. The rebels rapidly manufactured dozens of Molotov cocktails, filling empty rum bottles with gasoline and stuffing rags into the bottlenecks, systematically hurling them from the surrounding rooftops directly onto the overturned train cars. The glass bottles shattered against the thick steel plating, igniting the spilled gasoline and instantly engulfing the exterior of the train in intense, uncontrollable sheets of localized fire. The heavy steel armor of the boxcars, designed to deflect bullets, began to rapidly absorb the intense heat of the burning gasoline, transforming the interior compartments of the derailed train into suffocating, inescapable ovens. The 400 soldiers trapped inside, choking on the thick, acrid smoke and facing the very real prospect of being roasted alive within their own fortress, experienced an instantaneous collapse of combat morale. The junior officers, realizing that the high command in Havana had no ability to rescue them and lacking any desire to die for a dictator who remained safely hidden in the capital, mutinied against their senior commanders and demanded an immediate surrender. White flags of truce were desperately shoved out of the narrow firing slits of the burning boxcars, signaling the total, unconditional capitulation of the most armed, technologically advanced military unit in the entire province. When the rebel forces pried open the heavy steel doors and disarmed the gasping, soot-covered soldiers, they seized an arsenal so vast and comprehensive that it altered the strategic balance of the entire national conflict. Guevara's men catalogued and distributed thousands of modern assault rifles, bazookas, heavy machine guns, and millions of rounds of ammunition, essentially equipping the entire rebel army with the exact hardware required to march directly on Havana. The capture of the armored train and the subsequent surrender of the Santa Clara police headquarters just hours later effectively concluded the Battle of Santa Clara, resulting in a decisive, structurally permanent victory for the rebel coalition. The news of the train's derailment and the surrender of the elite troops spread rapidly across the island's military communication networks, serving as the exact, fatal moment the psychological spine of the Cuban armed forces finally snapped. Batista's generals, analyzing the loss of Santa Clara and the capture of their premier mobile fortress, realized that the highway to the capital was now unobstructed, and the military no longer possessed a reserve force capable of halting the rebel advance. The logistical reality of the conflict had inverted the ragged, starving survivors who had dragged themselves out of the coastal swamps 2 years prior now controlled the central arteries of the nation, while the conventional army retreated in total disarray. This catastrophic battlefield defeat stripped the dictatorship of its final tactical options, forcing the realization that the regime could no longer be salvaged through military force, political negotiation, or foreign intervention. The armored train lay burning quietly in the dirt of Santa Clara, a physical manifestation of a collapsed military doctrine, while the shockwaves of its destruction traveled swiftly toward the presidential palace, accelerating the final chaotic hours of the Republic. When the fundamental architecture of an authoritarian regime finally fractures under the compounding weight of its own military failures, the final hours are rarely characterized by fierce defensive battles, but rather by the rapid, cynical logistics of elite self-preservation. On the evening of December 31st, 1958, The glittering, neon-drenched capital of Havana was eagerly preparing for its annual, lucrative New Year's Eve celebrations, oblivious to the catastrophic military realities currently unfolding in the central provinces. Inside the massive guarded compound of the Camp Columbia military base, Fulgencio Batista hosted a formal traditional dinner party for his senior generals, his cabinet ministers, and a select, nervous group of loyal political enforcers. The dictator sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, projecting an aura of calm, meticulously maintained authority. Even as the distant destruction of his armored train in Santa Clara signaled the end of his regime, Batista understood utilizing a cold, rigorously objective logistical calculus that the rebel capture of the Central Highway had permanently severed his physical connection to the eastern half of the island, rendering his continued occupation of the presidential palace a military impossibility. Instead of stubbornly fighting a doomed, destructive urban battle that would inevitably result in his capture and execution, Batista initiated a pragmatic, organized exit strategy designed to preserve his life and his vast, illegally accumulated fortune. While the oblivious guests downstairs drank champagne and toasted the incoming year, Batista's private secretaries were quietly, furiously operating in the secured upper offices, packing millions of dollars in untraceable foreign currency into heavy leather suitcases. At precisely 2 in the morning on January 1, 1959, the dictator abruptly halted the New Year's festivities, summoning his highest-ranking military commanders into a private, guarded study to execute his final cynical administrative maneuver. He formally signed a legally dubious, expedited document handing control of the Cuban armed forces over to General Eulogio Cantillo, explicitly ordering the general to immediately form a temporary military junta and negotiate a ceasefire with the advancing rebels. With the bureaucratic paperwork finalized, Batista, his immediate family, and his closest political operatives quietly bypassed the sleeping, intoxicated city, driving directly to a secure military tarmac where 3 4-engine DC-4 transport aircraft were waiting in the freezing darkness. The heavy aircraft were meticulously, rapidly loaded with the highest echelons of the Cuban dictatorship, including the feared head of the secret police, senior cabinet members, and an estimated $300 million in guarded gold reserves and cash. At 3 in the morning, the heavy transport planes lifted off the runway, banking sharply over the dark, churning waters of the Florida Straits, setting a direct course for the neighboring Dominican Republic, where the fellow military dictator Rafael Trujillo had offered guaranteed political asylum. The sudden, unannounced departure of the Supreme Commander instantly triggered a massive, catastrophic command vacuum across the entire national security apparatus of the Cuban Republic, leaving the professional military leaderless and confused. When the sun slowly rose over Havana on the first morning of 1959, the city's population woke to the surreal, disorienting realization that the man who had brutally ruled their lives for 7 years had simply vanished into the night. The first demographic to fully comprehend the devastating logistical reality of this power vacuum was not the Cuban military or the domestic politicians, but the organized, paranoid operators of the American mafia. Meyer Lansky, the brilliant, analytical financial architect of the Havana casino empire, received early word of Batista's flight and immediately recognized that his massive, lucrative criminal syndicate was now unprotected by the state police. Lansky quietly, rapidly abandoned his luxurious suite at the Hotel Riviera, securing whatever hard currency he could physically carry, and joined a frantic, congested exodus of wealthy businessmen and corrupt politicians desperate to secure a seat on any commercial flight departing for Miami. Within hours of the dictator's flight, The impoverished, frustrated citizens of Havana realized that the feared military police were confined to their barracks, leading to a massive, spontaneous eruption of targeted, violently expressive public vandalism. Thousands of citizens poured into the streets, specifically targeting the glittering, neon-lit casinos, the luxury hotels, and the parking meters, which they viewed as the ultimate, hated physical symbols of the mafia's corruption and the dictatorship's immense greed. The crowds physically smashed the expensive imported slot machines with heavy iron pipes, dragged the pristine green felt roulette tables out of the Sevilla Biltmore Hotel, and set them ablaze in the busy intersections, violently dismantling the physical infrastructure of the American mob, while the streets of the capital descended into a cathartic, chaotic celebration. A tense, urgent geopolitical crisis was simultaneously unfolding inside the fortified walls of the United States Embassy. Ambassador Earl E.T. Smith, a staunch conservative supporter of the Batista regime, found himself staring at the total, undeniable collapse of American foreign policy in the Caribbean and a massive, expanding void in regional stability. The United States State Department explicitly, frantically ordered Ambassador Smith to prevent Fidel Castro from seizing power, instructing him to quickly manufacture a moderate, pro-American civilian government to replace the fleeing dictator and preserve the existing state infrastructure. Ambassador Smith actively collaborated with General Eulogio Contillo, attempting to execute a complex, cynical constitutional maneuver explicitly designed to steal the momentum of the revolution from the advancing rebel armies. The diplomats and the military commanders dusted off an obscure, technical provision within the suspended 1940 Cuban Constitution, locating Carlos Piedra, the oldest sitting judge on the Cuban Supreme Court, and explicitly ordered him to assume the role of provisional president of the republic. The rigorous strategic logic behind this specific maneuver was to quickly establish a moderate, legally plausible civilian government recognized by Washington, which could then legally order the Cuban military to halt the rebel advance and force Castro to accept a negotiated, compromised peace. However, Fidel Castro, who was currently stationed hundreds of miles away in the eastern city of Palma Soriano, actively monitored the civilian radio broadcasts from Havana and instantly recognized the massive, dangerous geopolitical trap being set by the American embassy. Castro possessed a rigorous, encyclopedic understanding of Cuban history, explicitly recalling the exact events of 1933, when a successful popular revolution against a dictator had been hijacked at the last minute by a United States-backed military junta. He realized that if Carlos Piedra was successfully sworn into office and formally recognized by the international diplomatic community, the rebels would instantly be transformed from heroic liberators into illegal, aggressive insurgents fighting against a recognized, legitimate civilian government. Operating with unrelenting tactical speed, Castro bypassed the traditional compromised political channels in Havana and utilized his most powerful, tested psychological weapon, broadcasting directly to the entire Cuban population via the transmission frequencies of Radio Rebelde. He explicitly, fiercely denounced the military junta orchestrated by General Contillo, warning the Cuban people that a massive, coordinated coup was actively attempting to steal the hard-won victories of the revolution and preserve the corrupt infrastructure of the old regime. To physically, logistically prevent the official swearing-in of Carlos Piedra, Castro issued a non-negotiable command for a massive, nationwide general strike, explicitly ordering every single worker, bus driver, and factory employee to immediately paralyze the entire Cuban economy. Castro specifically called upon the labor unions in Havana to shut down the capital, relying on the rigorous assumption that a provisional government could not possibly establish functional authority if the city it claimed to rule was frozen. Unlike the tragic, fragmented failure of the April strike the previous year, this January 1st general strike was a successful logistical triumph, fueled by the visible collapse of the dictatorship and the disappearance of the police force. Within an hour of Castro's radio broadcast, the entire sprawling city of Havana ground to a halt. As public transportation ceased, the electrical power grid fluctuated, and the major television stations were actively seized by armed, motivated union workers. The civilian population barricaded the major avenues, physically preventing the judges of the Supreme Court from reaching the presidential palace, thereby neutralizing the strict legal mechanism required to actually swear Carlos Piedra into the highest office. The carefully constructed, cynical political plan formulated by the United States Embassy and General Cantillo disintegrated before lunchtime, proving that the old political establishment possessed no remaining logistical or moral authority over the Cuban people. Recognizing that the capital was paralyzed by the strike and the conventional military was demoralized, Castro explicitly ordered his two most capable, trusted field commanders, Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, to immediately drive their victorious columns directly into the heart of Havana. Guevara and Cienfuegos commandeered civilian trucks, agricultural jeeps, and confiscated military transports, driving at maximum operational speed across the central highway, ignoring the armed military checkpoints where soldiers simply stood by and refused to fire upon the advancing rebels. The physical division of labor for securing the capital was meticulously planned. Guevara was specifically tasked with capturing the massive historic La Cabar fortress, a sprawling 18th-century military installation that guarded the entrance to Havana Bay and operated as the primary holding facility for political prisoners. Simultaneously, Cienfuegos was explicitly ordered to drive his guerrilla column directly to Camp Colombia, the massive, fortified nerve center of the entire Cuban military apparatus. The exact physical location where Fulgencio Batista had originally launched his illegal coup 7 years earlier. When Cienfuegos arrived at the guarded gates of Camp Colombia on January 2nd, the exhausted, disillusioned professional soldiers stationed inside refused to raise their rifles, choosing instead to quietly, respectfully, open the heavy iron gates for the advancing rebel forces. General Cantillo, outmaneuvered, humiliated by the total failure of his military junta and abandoned by his own troops, formally surrendered the largest military installation in the country to a 26-year-old former tailor wearing a wide-brimmed cowboy hat. Guevara similarly secured the formidable walls of La Cabar without firing a single shot, marching his battle-hardened, bearded guerrilla fighters directly into the pristine, manicured courtyards of the fortress, establishing the rebel army's physical control over the capital's strategic defense network. The entrenched, financed, American-backed military dictatorship that had brutally dominated the island for 7 years had collapsed within a compressed, chaotic span of exactly 48 hours, leaving behind a massive, volatile political vacuum. The old republic was dead, its wealthy elites fleeing toward Miami, its conventional military confined to their barracks, and its sprawling, lucrative mafia casinos lying in smoldering, vandalized ruins across the city. The desperate, coordinated efforts by the United States State Department to artificially install a moderate government had been neutralized by the rigorous, undeniable logistical reality of Castro's general strike and the swift, uncompromising military deployment of his top commanders. With the capital securely locked down by his most trusted lieutenants and the threat of a counter-coup erased, the path was clear for Fidel Castro to depart from the eastern mountains and claim his definitive victory. He did not immediately fly to Havana, choosing instead to embark on a slow, calculated overland journey across the entire length of the island, deliberately building a massive, undeniable wave of popular momentum that would cement his political supremacy. The isolated, dismissed guerrilla fighter who had washed ashore in a sinking yacht 2 years earlier was now actively preparing to march across the nation as the undisputed conqueror of the QZ banned state, setting the stage for the fundamental restructuring of the republic. When a revolutionary vanguard successfully fractures the established military order of a corrupt dictatorship, the speed at which they physically occupy the capital city often directly dictates the ultimate fragility of their newly acquired political authority. Fidel Castro rigorously understood this specific geopolitical vulnerability, explicitly recognizing that a sudden, unceremonious flight from the eastern mountains directly into Havana would isolate him within a complex urban environment he did not yet fully control. Instead of boarding a confiscated military aircraft to immediately claim the vacant presidential palace, Castro initiated a calculated, meticulously delayed overland journey spanning over 600 miles, historically designated as the Caravan of Liberty. He mounted a captured, modified military jeep, leading a massive visible convoy of confiscated transport trucks packed with battle-hardened, bearded guerrilla fighters directly across the central highway of the island. The rigorous strategic logic behind this agonizingly slow 7-day procession was explicitly designed to physically project his military supremacy across every single province, systematically absorbing the adulation of millions of rural citizens. By deliberately delaying his arrival, Castro successfully provided his trusted commanders, Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, with the exact necessary tactical window to disarm the remaining conventional military garrisons securing the capital. As the massive convoy slowly rolled through the provincial capitals of Camagüey and Santa Clara, hundreds of thousands of exhausted, impoverished Cubans lined the streets, throwing flowers and chanting the names of the rebel commanders. These armed men, famously known as the Barbudos due to their long, untrimmed beards, wore heavy combat boots, draped themselves in Catholic rosaries, and carried captured American M1 Garand rifles, presenting a striking, authentic visual of rustic rebellion. Castro utilized every single major stop along the route to deliver grueling, multi-hour speeches from the balconies of local town halls, deliberately forging an unbreakable personal psychological bond with the working-class civilian population. He explicitly bypassed the traditional corrupted local politicians who attempted to welcome him, choosing instead to address the crowds directly, actively cultivating a profound, unmediated relationship between the supreme leader and the masses. By the time the sprawling military convoy finally reached the congested outskirts of Havana on January 8, 1959, Castro was no longer merely a successful guerrilla commander. He had systematically transformed himself into the undeniable physical manifestation of the Cuban state. The triumphant entrance into the capital was a masterpiece of orchestrated political theater as the rebels drove directly down the Malican seawall, surrounded by a massive, emotional crowd of over 500,000 screaming residents. Castro deliberately bypassed the opulent presidential palace, where the moderate American-backed provisional government was desperately attempting to establish order, directing his convoy instead toward the fortified gates of Camp Columbia. Camp Columbia was the massive, sprawling military nerve center of the old republic, the exact physical location where Fulgencio Batista had launched his illegal coup 7 years prior, making it the ultimate symbolic venue for Castro's victory address. That evening, under the blinding glare of massive television spotlights, Castro stepped up to a wooden podium surrounded by armed guerrilla fighters to deliver his first official address to the anxious residents of the capital. He discarded traditional, formal political rhetoric, speaking to the massive crowd in a quiet, intimate, conversational tone, explicitly acknowledging the profound, terrifying administrative difficulties that lay ahead for the broken nation. In the middle of this broadcast, nationally televised speech, Castro famously turned to his trusted, popular military commander standing directly behind him and asked a simple, authentic question, asking if he was doing well. Camilo Cienfuegos warmly, publicly validated his commander on live television, an unscripted, humanizing exchange that instantly cemented the unquestionable unity of the revolutionary leadership in the minds of the Cuban public. It was precisely during this specific televised address that a profound, authentic minor plot occurred, one that permanently elevated Castro from a mortal political leader into a quasi-mythological national savior. As Castro continued to passionately speak about the future of the Republic, someone in the massive crowd released a small flock of white doves into the humid night air, a traditional symbol of peace meant to celebrate the end of the violent dictatorship. Instead of scattering into the dark sky, one of the white doves fluttered directly down toward the illuminated podium and quietly, calmly landed squarely upon Fidel Castro's left shoulder, remaining there undisturbed for several minutes. In a nation rooted in the syncretic spiritual traditions of Catholicism and Afro-Cuban Santa art, the visual of a white dove landing on a bearded savior carrying a rifle was instantly interpreted as an undeniable sign of divine validation. The massive crowd erupted into a state of religious ecstasy, thoroughly convinced that the bearded rebel possessed a sacred, impenetrable mandate from the heavens to restructure their society. This accidental, specific moment of biological serendipity provided Castro with a level of unshakable psychological authority that no democratic election, legal constitution, or military victory could ever possibly bestow upon a standard politician. However, the romantic, mythological euphoria of the victory was almost immediately counterbalanced by the cold, pragmatic, and brutally rigorous application of revolutionary justice. Castro understood, relying entirely on the rigorous historical precedent of the 1954 Guatemalan coup that had radicalized Che Guevara, that the new government could never truly survive if the physical infrastructure of Batista's military was allowed to remain intact. He recognized that the thousands of professional soldiers, police interrogators, and government informants who had brutalized the civilian population still resided within the capital, representing a massive, dangerous sleeper cell capable of launching a violent counter-revolution. To eradicate this existential threat, Castro authorized Che Guevara, operating from his newly established command post at the massive La Cabana fortress, to initiate a systematic, ruthless purge of the old military apparatus. Guevara established an efficient legal mechanism known as the Purification Commission within the damp, limestone walls of the 18th-century fortress, explicitly designed to identify, prosecute, and execute the worst offenders of the Batista regime. These streamlined revolutionary tribunals operated outside the bounds of traditional, deliberate constitutional law, lacking formal defense discovery and relying on the emotional, traumatic testimonies of civilian victims who had survived the torture chambers of the secret police. Hundreds of former military officers, police commanders, and known informants were summarily convicted of war crimes and immediately marched out to the deep execution trenches of the fortress, where they were shot by armed rebel firing squads. While the international diplomatic community, particularly the United States State Department, expressed profound vocal outrage over the severe lack of due process, the Cuban working class overwhelmingly supported the executions as a necessary, cathartic national cleansing. To publicly validate this lethal purge, the revolutionary government organized a massive, terrifying public trial for Major Jesus Sosa Blanco, a notorious Batista commander implicated in the brutal massacre of dozens of rural peasant families in the Oriente province. Instead of holding the trial in a quiet, secure courtroom, The government deliberately hosted the proceedings inside the massive circular Havana Sports Palace, packing the stadium with over 17,000 furious, vocal civilian spectators. The trial physically resembled a massive, brutal Roman circus, with thousands of citizens screaming for blood from the concrete bleachers while armed guards paraded the stoic, doomed military officer before a panel of rebel judges. Sosa Blanco was swiftly convicted and executed, demonstrating with rigorous, undeniable clarity that the revolutionary government possessed unquestioning control over the physical lives of its citizens and monopolized the state's capacity for violence. By systematically executing the senior leadership of Batista's military, Castro permanently dismantled the only existing institutional framework capable of challenging his authority, effectively replacing the national army with his own loyal guerrilla forces. With the conventional military threat eradicated, Castro turned his massive analytical intellect toward the quiet, methodical dismantling of the moderate, civilian political coalition that had nominally supported the revolution during its infancy. In the initial weeks of January, the official government of Cuba was technically led by Provisional President Manuel Urrutia, a respected, conservative former judge who had bravely defended the Moncada rebels in court years earlier. Urrutia appointed a cabinet filled with moderate, educated lawyers, economists, and traditional politicians, operating under the flawed assumption that Castro would simply return to his law practice and allow the civilians to govern the newly restored republic. But the rigorous, undeniable logistical reality of power in Havana dictated that the actual, functioning government did not reside within the opulent, guarded halls of the presidential palace where Urrutia held his formal bureaucratic meetings. The epicenter of the Cuban state was officially relocated to the sprawling 23rd floor penthouse suite of the Havana Hilton Hotel, quickly renamed the Habana Libre, where Fidel Castro had established his personal chaotic military command center. Foreign diplomats, powerful labor leaders, and prominent international journalists bypassed the presidential palace, traveling directly to the hotel to secure a vital audience with the bearded rebel who actually controlled the guns, the media, and the masses. This unsustainable, bizarre duality of power created massive administrative friction as President Urrutia attempted to implement cautious, moderate economic policies while Castro continually utilized national television to promise radical, sweeping wealth redistribution. The specific, authentic minor plot that finally shattered this fragile political illusion occurred in mid-February, when Prime Minister José María Cardona, frustrated by his inability to actually govern the country, abruptly resigned from his post. Cardona explicitly recognized that attempting to issue formal administrative directives without the prior, televised approval of the rebel commander was a futile, humiliating bureaucratic exercise that undermined the civilian cabinet. Following Cardona's sudden resignation, Fidel Castro formally legally accepted the position of Prime Minister, immediately demanding and receiving sweeping new executive powers that subordinated the office of the president to the operational control of the military vanguard. President Urrutia was rapidly marginalized into a ceremonial, powerless figurehead, forced to quietly sign radical, sweeping legislative decrees drafted entirely by Castro's inner circle of guerrilla veterans, including the massive agrarian reform law of May 1959. When Urrutia finally attempted to publicly push back against the rapidly accelerating communist influence within the government in July, stalling on critical signatures, Castro executed a brilliant, ruthless display of political manipulation. Castro abruptly, unexpectedly resigned from his position as Prime Minister on live television, falsely claiming that President Arusha's stubborn conservatism was actively preventing the revolution from enacting vital legislation designed to help the poorest cities. Ends. The Cuban public, terrified of losing their mythological savior and manipulated by the state-controlled radio stations, erupted into massive, aggressive street protests surrounding the presidential palace and demanding Arusha's immediate, unconditional resignation. Arusha, recognizing that the heavy, angry crowds were fully capable of breaching the palace gates and murdering him, quickly surrendered his office and fled into the protective custody of a foreign embassy, vacating the political battlefield. Castro smoothly, triumphantly returned to the office of Prime Minister just days later, having permanently eliminated the last remaining vestige of the moderate, democratic coalition that had initially supported the overthrow of Batista. The profound, concentrated consolidation of power was now undeniable, marking the exact specific moment the dynamic, romanticized guerrilla movement definitively crystallized into a rigid, bureaucratic authoritarian state. The young, ambitious lawyer who had once bravely sued a military dictator in a desperate attempt to restore the constitutional republic had systematically, relentlessly constructed a massive policed dictatorship entirely of his own design. This is the ultimate, tragic paradox of every successful armed revolution, revealing the cold, unyielding historical law that the specific, aggressive tools required to violently dismantle a tyranny are inherently unsuitable for building a functional, transparent democracy. To survive the grueling, unforgiving environment of the Sierra Maestra, the rebels had been forced to adopt military discipline, centralize their decision-making, and ruthlessly eliminate any hint of internal political dissent. When those exact same hardened, uncompromising guerrilla commanders marched out of the jungle and occupied the marble ministries of the capital, they simply applied those strict, lethal military doctrines to the civilian governance of an entire nation. The promise of holding free, contested democratic elections, a foundational pillar of Castro's famous courtroom defense in Santiago, was quietly, permanently shelved, replaced by the suffocating, monolithic architecture of a single-party socialist state. The independent, critical Cuban newspapers that had courageously defied Batista's censorship were systematically absorbed by the new government, transforming the vibrant national press into a massive controlled organ for state propaganda. The very same passionate, educated university students who had marched alongside Castro to overthrow a brutal strongman soon found themselves monitored, persecuted, and frequently imprisoned by the armed intelligence apparatus of their former ally. The rebel had not destroyed the institution of absolute power, he had merely conquered it, meticulously remodeling the imposing machinery of state control to perfectly fit the precise, specific dimensions of his own ideological vision. As we step back from the smoke, the cheering crowds, and the guarded execution walls of this defining historical chapter, we are forced to confront a sobering, enduring reality regarding the nature of human power. The intoxicating, romanticized narrative of the underdog fighting a noble war against systemic corruption almost always obscures the quiet, insidious process by which the victorious liberator slowly, methodically morphs into the new oppressor. The iron-willed regime that Castro forged would go on to survive for decades, successfully defying massive economic blockades, surviving countless assassination attempts, and serving as a polarizing, isolated flashpoint in a terrifying global Cold War. But the original beautiful dream of a free, democratic Cuban republic, the specific dream that had inspired 82 freezing men to board a leaking yacht in the middle of a winter storm, died the moment they finally secured power. History, in its cold, unsentimental wisdom, continuously reminds us that building a society based on genuine human freedom requires a level of institutional humility that a victorious, armed supreme commander is rarely ever willing to provide. The transition from exiled rebel to supreme commander was a masterpiece of unmatched logistical brilliance and unyielding psychological endurance. Yet it ultimately birthed a nation frozen in the unblinking shadow of a single man.